whole lot I wanted to talk about today, and I just wanted to say, hey,
You're
Jason.
you're looking a bit different. You get a new haircut or something?
Oh man, yeah, it's this thing was crazy. I had to just pop it on and surprise you just for fun. I saw it when this thing showed up. I saw it and I was like, I gotta message Jason and just pop this thing on right at the beginning and just if I could if I didn't have such a giant head, I would leave it on throughout this entire stream just so I could talk to you like this. I can actually see through it. It's really weird because it looks like you can probably just see my room instead. It looks like I can't see anything and I'm just in some weird VR world, but it's
It legit looks like something out of Tron, like the new remakes.
it's weird. It's crazy. It's pretty cool though. Like I said, if my head wasn't so huge, it's pretty neat. It's so I keep falling for YouTube and Facebook ads and stuff. So like those things work great on me. I always wondered, like, I wonder if ads work on people. I realized that when you actually watch them, they do. And I keep seeing YouTube ads and Facebook ads because I'm on there all the time, and I find neat things. And I'm like, I gotta try it. I gotta try that. I gotta try it. So I saw
See,
that.
I did exactly the same thing yesterday with the split keyboard thing. Have you seen that?
Yeah, which one?
Yeah, there's so many. There's it's a new one. I forgot that. Let me just check the name of the damn
You
thing
have to
out.
share it. I have to check this out.
Yeah, it's just I had no interest. Suddenly, just I was just sitting there, and within minutes of me going, yeah, I could try that, and I just bought this random thing. Where is it?
Yeah, that's pretty much me constantly though. I see random like cool tech stuff. If I ever find neat like tech things, I just have to get them and I just get excited and try them out. And that thing is actually pretty
Speaking of,
cool. But
actually, I have right here my own current niche tech thing. So I recently picked this up. This arrived on Friday. So these are the Monogram modular deck things. And so there's a whole sea of these. You can just stitch things together.
oh
They're
wow,
basically editing tools. Yeah. These are really nice for video editing and audio editing. You can basically scrub timelines and things. Makes it very handy. So.
yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, I get into that stuff. I just have to try it all out and see like what's going to be good, what's cool, what stuff sucks, and I occasionally just find things that are really neat and have a lot of fun. I've also been playing with that Next Mind. Where's that headset at? There it is. This thing quite a bit the last few days. This so I think I briefly showed it to you and everybody else a couple days ago. It's this mind reading headset. I don't think I showed anybody put on though. It's just like this. It basically like a little headband pops on. This thing actually doesn't hurt my head. So I have that old the Emotive Epoch one that I used to try to wear, but here I'll pull it down and show you.
Apparently, the name of the keyboard was the Moonlander. That's the one I went with.
Moonlander. I'll have to check that out. I don't know if I've seen that.
Mark 1. Yeah,
it was this one, and this thing like squeezed my head and stuff, and it was kind of painful. This other one, it's not like I could wear this walking. I did wear it walking around the house yesterday, and my wife kept looking at me like I was a lunatic. She's like, "What the hell are you doing?" But it was really cool. It actually worked. Like I was able to look at and focus on something and have it actually know that that's what I'm looking at and focusing on and select it. I mean, cool. From what I can tell, it's mostly, I think it's like visual cortex reading, matching up the images that are flashing there with what it's detecting from there, but it's really pretty freaking cool. So you actually have to kind of concentrate on the spot, but once you get it down, it's neat. It's interesting. My wife didn't believe it. She thought I was just bullshitting, that I was somehow controlling it with like a remote control under the desk, or that it was just detecting that I was turning my head. She was very, very skeptical. I think I've taught her too much that most people are hacking and cheating on.
It's a good way to be.
It's just detecting that you're turning your head. That's not really doing it. I was like, no. I was like, watch this. I don't have to move my head. This is perfectly still. Like it's. Do whatever one you pick it, and it was really cool. So it's definitely cool, a neat thing. I'm gonna do a video on this pretty soon. I might just do a stream on it too. I wanted to come up with like a neat game to control with it. That's the harder part. Like I had lots of ideas before, but when I think them through, like making them actually fun and interactive is a lot harder. Like I can make anything that like responds, but making something that's fun that responds with the constraint of like you need to actually pay attention to and look at this thing to make it do something. And then if the rest of the game is distracting, in a fun way that also makes it harder to play. Like, how do you got to kind of balance all that out, I guess. But
one of the things I did for a client, which might kind of tie into that idea, is we did a training thing for pilots where there's so many dials and trying to keep the altimeters and things at the right levels. And the idea is that if you're not paying attention, very quickly one of those dials can turn, and that can put you in serious trouble if you're not keeping them all level. So they're trained to keep a constant sort of subconscious watch where in their periphery, they're making sure all the dials are roughly at the right levels. And so what we were doing is when you looked away for too long, the dials would start to tick down. And so you could have something like that where you have to basically like think the dials into the right positions and things and try to keep the focus active for all of the different things that need to be leveled.
Yeah. It'd just be hard to make that fun.
You'd be surprised. Like, it's one of those things that the panic starts to build up and you start to get pretty engaged in the idea. At least it worked for us.
Yeah. Interesting. So what are you thinking? Like, you got just different panels and you got to, because the way that it works is like you have to look at a spot. Like, imagine there's like the best thing to focus is there's like this little triangle, this little green triangle, and as you're focusing, they have an indicator that like it gets tighter and tighter, right? And
well, what I mean is like imagine you're doing some task. So there's something in the distance, like some box you're moving or doing something that could even be like without using that, just using a gamepad or something. And then there's also a number of dials for like energy levels and power consumption and whatever. And over the course of playing, those levels could go into dangerous zones, and you have to look at them and like stare them down and focus them into the right position. So they're not the main game, but they're things that you have to constantly pay attention to. And so that keeping your attention on both things would be the drama of trying to focus on two things at once. And if you ramp up that experience, that could be a fun arc.
That would be. I think that the issue with that and the part that it kind of lacks versus like an eye tracking that would handle that is that you have to be flashing these images over it. So if it was over the gauges are going to be interacting with the images and probably make it a lot less responsive on it, because it's trying to like match the little flashings. And their recommendation is generally like flash it, put it on like a gray surface that's solid. It does work on some other things, but I would imagine that with something moving, it'd be less responsive. But maybe it would just work anyway. I guess it's worth a try. I mean, it could be neat.
You can always start with the basics of like the classic marble game, right? Like you've got something you're trying to focus on, and there's like a ball dropping, and you try to make sure it doesn't fall off, just to at least get a sense of what it can or can't do well from a gameplay perspective.
Yeah, I've tried a couple things. One of the things I was thinking about doing. So here, let me give you two of my ideas. One was a really old one, and it was just when I got this thing, one of the first things I thought was like, hey, I want to make like a VR hang glider that you can mind control. I was like, that'd be kind of cool. Like you could just mind control, like, hey, I want to tilt to the right. And like you tilt to the right. And it's relatively chill. And it seemed like a cool thing that like, even if you were totally paralyzed, you could like fly around and do things and have some control over it and have it be relatively chill. It doesn't seem like the most fun and exciting game though, or like it'd be an interesting thing, but it'd be like a neat little experience that people would try out for a second, be like, oh, that was cool, and then never do again. The other option was like a Clash Royale type game where you have to mind control it. So I was thinking maybe you've got like, 2 lines of bases or 3 or whatever, and your card comes up for your next dude that's going to spawn, and you have to concentrate on the tower that you want him to spawn at. And if you're not concentrating, it doesn't spawn at all. So you got to like get over there and concentrate on it to make them spawn when it's time on whichever one you wanted to do.
I always like those kinds of things. Yeah.
Like a more interesting gameplay thing, but less of a usable thing. I don't know.
Another one is I just love tower defense games, and so having something where the towers don't do their own targeting, but you have to focus on what they target would be something falls into the same category, right? Where you've got a bunch of towers and you have to, there's multiple lanes, and it's your job to like focus on which towers focus on which things.
Yeah, like look at the bosses. I think you can track up to 10 things at a time on the screen. Is what it'll do. So you could do like lanes and then bosses. Like if you want to focus fire on a boss, that could be cool too. Like a neat little tower defense where you're just doing that. Yeah, I like it. Lots of cool ideas. All right. So yeah, I don't know. That was the main stuff I wanted to talk about today was just tech stuff and the problem with just getting started. So there's a lot of different tech stuff that we could jump into and talk about, like different devices and things. I was actually thinking about
I have like thousands of dollars of pointless technology within reach of me. I could definitely start pulling things out if that's what you wanted to do.
Without a doubt. I was thinking the same thing. I was thinking about actually maybe just doing some reviews on the tech stuff that I think is actually cool, like the stuff that doesn't suck. But I guess beyond that, just on the regular game dev stuff, there was something that popped up earlier. I think I saw even last night that reminded me of what I wanted to talk about and made me really think about it, which was on just the getting into the game dev industry and how to do that, and kind of how people recommend. Let me just pull up the Reddit thread. I saved off this Milanote note for myself of this Reddit thread if I can find it. I'm going to pull it right up. And it was basically just from somebody who wants to get into game development. And they were asking, like, how do I stand out? And like, if you're working in, I'm just going to pull the thing up. I feel like I could just talk and never get my words right. I sent it to myself is the other trick that I've got. Half the things that I want to keep track of, I just email to myself. So I'm going to drop the Reddit thread into YouTube chat so everybody can see exactly what I'm talking about, and you can see it too. So it was this post, and it basically said, I'm going to be entering my 4th year of university this fall. I'll be completing an honors in CS with a minor in math. Why don't I screen share? Let's do that too. Let's hit screen share and share up this Chrome tab. There we go. And it says, I'm not naive to the incredible competition for entry-level positions at AAA studios. I understand getting a job with a great company come graduation is unlikely. Sorry, all the coughing there. I also know that being hired for a software position generally requires a good portfolio. It says, what does a strong entry-level portfolio look like? I also know that specialization is key. Following some great advice given to me somewhere else, I've been spending significant amount of time thinking about which of my skills and interests are most likely to get me in the door. So trying to figure out like what to specialize in, and how to do a portfolio. And it says, I've got a beginner grade in data science, Unreal, software engineering. Additionally, I'm most interested in developing these skills in addition to procedural generation and game AI. Which of my skills and interests would return the most in development and highest demand? So I think this is something that a lot of people kind of wonder, and it was something that I wondered, getting into game development. I only have a tiny bit of experience with this. I'm sure that there are people watching right now that have lots of really good ideas and lots of great suggestions here, and there's probably a whole lot more in this thread now. In fact, it looks like new comments as of 23 hours ago. This is shortly after I read it. So there's probably a lot of good insight in here, but I thought that we could just talk a little bit about it and give a little bit of feedback based on personal experience. I don't know if you're up for that, but
sure.
Yeah. So I guess just to start off, like there's a bunch of things here. First is like, what does a good entry level portfolio look like? And then I think we should talk about specialization after that. But for an entry level portfolio, there's a lot of discussion in the thread there. The biggest things are that you want to show that, one, you're really interested in game development. The more you seem interested in game development, the more you're going to stand out. Because if you've got two people that are into a job or that are going in for a job, if one person loves that job, that's their life, that's the thing they like to do, the other person just wants it for a job, it's kind of a no-brainer on which one's going to have a huge advantage. Even if the other one has a bigger degree, went somewhere longer, they're not into it. Like they're not into it. I mean, think about like you're hiring a nature photographer, right? Two people come to you. One person loves nature photography, talks about pictures, takes pictures all the time, has a blog where they just go out and take pictures of birds. They love that stuff, and they went to some 2-year community college and learned it, but they've been doing it forever. They're really into the birds and nature stuff. And the other person's like, yeah, I got a degree in it. I took some pictures for a project, and here's my resume. You can see I did a project once. The obvious choice there is just going to be you go with the person who's into it, the person who's interested in it and really loves it, not the person who's got some more experience there. So in your portfolio, I guess the point is, in the portfolio, you really want to show passion, show that you really love what you're doing or that you're really into it, because the more that you can show that, the better you'll stand out. The other thing you want to show is that you actually get things done. So if you've got any projects that you've finished, completed, released, I mean, they don't, when I say finished, I mean they got to the point where they're done enough that you can play it. It's a game that somebody can try out, and maybe it doesn't have more than one level. Maybe it's buggy, maybe it's not perfect, but it's something that you've actually built, completed, and were able to release. That stands out a lot for prospective employers, because it means that you understand it enough to go through the entire process, and that anything that you didn't understand going through that process, you tried to figure out, and you figured out on your own, and you didn't just get stuck and give up. A lot of the time people will do like, a portion of a thing and never understand the way that everything ties together, or they'll only have worked on school projects. They've never done anything that wasn't an assigned school project that was given to them by a professor, where they had a team. And on those, to be honest, like, you really never know how much of that project was done by the one person, especially if they're not telling you and they're not putting that forward and giving really good examples and really good explanations and showing that in their portfolio. So if you have done that stuff and you've been leading those, then hey, push that. I would say promote that and talk a lot about that. I'm going to bring Jason right back in. And then I think he's probably got a bit more insight into just portfolios and stuff. But I think in general, showing that you've got stuff done, that you're able to complete projects, that you're able to work on things, and that you actually have a large interest in the topic outside of actual schooling is extremely important, and will go way further than just about anything else. What do you got for portfolios?
So the interesting thing, when you say interest as a thing that's needed, I remember hearing that advice myself, and I used to dismiss it out of hand as some sort of vague, oh yeah, interest is always good, everyone likes having interest. But it's actually more than that, and I think it's something that people don't really appreciate. If you're hiring, because again, I think Jason can attest as well, we've both hired a lot of people, we've been literally deciding if someone gets the job. We don't look for interest just because it's nice if someone's optimistic. It's not just sort of some hack in the interview to look good. If someone is interested, it means we know that they will do extra work outside of the hours of the job. So what that subtly says to us is there's a certain amount of hours you hire someone for, and oftentimes any job you're going to be unskilled at certain tasks. You could be really good at X but not know Y. And the question is, are you going to expect us to pay you to learn that stuff? Or are you going to be interested enough to learn it in your free time? And people who are enthusiastic are just naturally going to spend their free time also trying to get better at the things that they're doing for a living. So it's not a passive thing. It's actually very, very valuable to someone who's hiring to find somebody who is going to be a self-starter and motivated and getting better at their job.
Yeah. I think it's the case with just about almost any job. Like, I mean, think of hiring like a carpenter. You've got somebody coming in to do some building work or something. You want to hire somebody who likes to do that stuff. Somebody who, if they're working on stuff at their house, would be building it for fun. They would really enjoy it. You're going to want to pick the people that are really passionate about what they do. They're just generally going to do a better job. They're going to be more likely to learn and grow, like I said, on the job and outside of the job, and bring new things in too. They won't just be only learning from your company. They're going to learn from outside and bring in new ideas and new information. And companies really love that. If you can come in and like introduce new ideas and new concepts that are time saving and helpful for the team, and you do it in a way that's not, confrontational and aggressive, it can have a big payoff. So something I recommend doing. Any other portfolio suggestions?
Yeah, the other one is, one of the comments here is that specialization is key. I would heavily contest that. I would say that specialization is key in a certain scenario, which is if you want to work in a big soulless corporation, there's certain softwares that are always used and stuff you've probably never heard of. These are like monolithic tools that someone built into some system 20 years ago. And you can become a specialist in that, and you will get a really good salary because nobody wants to do that job anymore. And you'll be particularly set for life if you're willing to be really proficient at a very specific kind of technology or language or job or whatever. But I don't think that really tracks anymore these days. The problem is, we're in such a connected world that if I want to hire a quote unquote expert in something, I'm not going to go out through the standard interview channels and just hope they happen to be particularly proficient. I will look for somebody with that skill. I will go on a hard Google search and I will find people who are commenting in forums or writing articles or doing something, and I will reach out directly if I need someone for a particular technology. You're not going to compete with that. So I don't really try, and I don't really aim people try to be sort of an expert in X unless they're genuinely interested in it. Like, you don't become an expert in something by accident. You tend to just already be enjoying it so much, you're putting a lot of work in, and you end up becoming an expert in that thing. So I would say, if anything, you're better off aiming to be a generalist that can talk to the most amount of people, learn how everyone does their job, be knowledgeable about everything that you can. And then as time goes by, you'll certainly start to notice certain areas you provide more value in, and then you can start choosing what to specialize in. You don't tend to just pick specialization to start with, because you could pick something that's not good for you, or it's just something random that you don't really have the chops for. So I would say I usually recommend people start by being a generalist and then work their way towards specialization as their career matures and they get more proficient in certain areas.
Yeah, I think that does make a lot of sense just in general for learning and making sure that you pick specializations that actually are good for you, because you're not wrong. I've seen a lot of people just kind of randomly choose something because they heard about it and thought that it was like, no, I should do that one because I heard that one was good. That's definitely the wrong way to do it. But there is definitely a bit of value, I think, in having some specialties when it comes to applying for some of these AAA jobs. If you're going in and you
Sure.
just want to be like a gameplay programmer at working on Call of Duty or something, it's going to be a lot easier if you have some experience or some specialization in a tool that they're using that they're not very used to yet, something that's new, something that not a lot of people are into, whatever that is, whatever it is. I don't even know what they're using anymore. But if you have specific knowledge about certain tools or certain things that a lot of people don't have that they're using, that I'd say is the easiest way to get in, the easiest way to get a win. Because a lot of the time when you're looking through resumes, sometimes you'll see keywords on there and you're like, that is actually a thing that we're interested in. And if they're good at it, we think that might help us a lot. So hiring them has this extra benefit of bringing in this new skill set or bringing in this new set of tooling.
That is a fair comment. Like, I will say, the first filter between resumes tends to be, I've got 8 technologies in mind. If I see at least 4 of these keywords on the resume, they'll make the pile. If they don't have even 4 of the 8 things that I think they should know, then there's no point in me basically training them into 8 different technologies. So having some is a good idea. Some specialization tools that you know, especially as you said, relative to what the company wants or needs. It's always a good idea to do your homework.
What they want and need. Like, like, hey, the company that I'm working at, usually when people want to work in a AAA place, they have a company or a set of companies that they want to work at. I would say if you can learn the things that they're using or that they want to use, that will help a lot more than just about anything else, and really targeting that stuff too. And you'll find that the other nice thing about it is if you find out that you really hate that thing that they're using, you can just not take that job and go do something else. Find a different path. But
yeah, like I've literally seen resumes where people have applied for a job and they're using like a completely different engine than the place they're hiring for, and it's like, well, what can we do with that? you don't know the tools that we're using, and so I appreciate the resume, but like, we don't have time to teach someone for 4 years to learn it.
Exactly. And I think that part of that question too mentioned specializing in Unreal. Now, that I would recommend. If you're going to get into game development and you want to start applying at a company, find out what game engine they use and work in that game engine. Focus on working in that game engine. Learn as much as you can about it, and really make that your priority, because that's what you're going to be doing. That's what you're going to be working on. Knowing other things is nice. It's cool. It's great to know 3 different game engines, 4 different engines, or 5 different languages. It's super handy. But if you're just trying to get the job, the most important thing is knowing the actual tools that they're using, because like you said, nobody wants to sit around and train you for years. I mean, the problem is you have two options, right? You've got, I can hire this developer that's been working with my tools and engine where I can say, hey, go do this thing, and they can go do it. Or I can hire this other developer where I have to show them how to do all of these things many, many times for years and teach them, and then hope that they stay around after they're proficient in it. So be good at the tools. The better you are at the specific tools that they have, the more likely you are to get in. Even if you're just like cramming and trying to learn it as quick as possible before the interview, like do that. If you're, maybe you focus totally on Unity development, you go in for an Unreal interview or go in for an Unreal position, stop what you're doing, focus 100% on Unreal stuff until that interview is done. Like just do that. Or if it's the opposite, switch. Whatever it is, just focus on the thing that company needs, and worry about learning that thing and getting good at that and being as fresh on that as possible before the interview and as you're going through that process.
I guess that's where the disconnect is when we're talking about specialization. I guess we have to clarify terms, because to me, I don't call that specialization, because to be honest, knowing your tools to me isn't a specialized skill. Everyone should know the tools with which they're using. Specialization to me is when you're aiming to be good at one thing in those tools. Like you're angling to be a modeler who models characters versus a modeler who models levels and designs or whatever. Now that is a different skill.
You could be a modeler who uses ZBrush or
exactly.
I mean, it's, and I think kind of at this point we're talking about specialization at the very junior, like just out of college beginner level. So they haven't probably gotten too much. Yeah, but you're not wrong. I totally continue because I totally agree.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I guess if the phrase is should you split your attention? No. Yes, you should pick whatever it is you aim to do and learn to get good enough at it that people would want to hire you at it. But I guess the idea is once you get in the door, once you've said I'm a Unity dev or I'm an Unreal dev and I'm in the door, don't focus solely on what it is you're now doing. Make a point of learning what everyone in the team's jobs are. Go hang out with them, go find out. And you may be specializing in Unreal, but like you want to know what the pipeline is to get art into Unreal. You want to know what the optimization tricks that are being done to kind of get the engine running faster are. You want to know what the QA team are doing and if they have any build pipeline stuff that they're doing for automated testing. You want to just ask as many questions and be as familiar with as much of the kind of landscape, because like there are people you could hire just a DevOps guy and they will do all of the back. They'll never even touch the game engine, but they're vital to the process of making that game run. And so there's a million jobs that you may never even see or think are jobs unless you know all of the steps. So I would say just make a point of learning as much of it. Like you can quote unquote specialize to the point where you get your foot in the door, but once you're there, like you want to find out how complicated a job can be and how many tools there are, because you may decide when you're there, that job looks better than mine. I want to start specializing in that direction now rather than where I was before. And you'll often see a huge route is people come in through testing or QA and then move into dev or vice versa. So that does happen a lot, that you don't want to sort of just pigeonhole yourself into one thing, because you will limit your option in the future.
Yeah. This is, I don't know. Specializing is, when I think about it, I'm just thinking more and more about specialization for programmers, not so much just in game development, but in code in general, and the different specializations that you really kind of ran into. Like the biggest things that I would see were obviously the graphics programmers. There were people who just loved the graphic stuff. They liked basically the rendering side and the 3D math. They were very into both. They really liked both of those things a lot. There were, I've known a couple guys who really like to specialize in networking stuff. They just had an obsession with the way that networks work and optimizing it. But it's always like with everything outside of graphics, I'm starting to think through all of these other things. With everything outside of graphics, it's always like a sub-specialization, right? It's like they do that, but it's not the only thing that they do. Like graphics programmers, a specialization where like there's enough work there that's all you do is graphics work. You don't do anything else. There's no need to do anything else. But just about every other type of specialization, I feel like you're still doing a lot of other things. You're still doing a lot of that general work as well. It's more just
like you might be great at GPU math, and so you're basically the person people go to when they're doing like optimized particle systems. But like you're not just the particle system guy. You're just going to be the person doing that thing. Or you might be particularly proficient at tool development, and you might make the best. You might know how to do the best tools for things like reading in text files and making your own file formats, and you may have experience in WinForms or WPF for some external tool development that other people don't, or you might be the web API type guy who builds all of the connection stuff there. So yes, there are those specializations, but I find maybe it is just my career, but I just bounce between all of them. I don't find that I ever get stuck in one of those roles. At least I try not to, because I find it's more valuable to try to find value wherever it is in a company and work on that.
Yeah, I find that, like I said, graphics programmer is the only one that I think I've seen consistently where like the graphics programmer is only working on that. And it's just because there's a sheer insane amount of graphics code work to do. And it's a lot of time been with, Unreal or even Unity, just doing custom stuff that the editor or the engine just doesn't support by default. So they got to constantly keep working to push the bounds and push the edges. And you'll see that a lot in AAA games. Like you're going to actually see teams of graphic programmers, like engineers who are just working on the graphics part and the rendering part. And you might, to some degree, on some of the teams, see that for networking or database stuff. But I would expect that on a much, much smaller scale, and that to be more, a lot more in a platform and support role than an actual development side. Because once the development part's done, it's done. There's not a whole lot that changes there.
And again, to be really clear too, because I don't know how well this is coming across, but there's a difference between trying to be equally as good at everything and being a specialist or generalist. Like, I don't mean you have to try to be equally as good at everything. Like, you're going to have proficiencies you're better at, and you're going to focus on those things. You're going to spend more time at it, and just by transitive properties of working on that the most, you will get better at those things. But I think if you brand yourself as a specialist, you're almost by design saying you're not doing other things. But if you instead have a certain thing you favor doing, like, I spent most of my entire studying life as a programmer. I spent all of my time learning system architecture. That was the stuff I enjoyed the most. But now I've done tons of other stuff. I've done web stuff and mobile stuff and project management stuff, and I didn't say no to any of those options when they came up. But I still have my preferences, right? There's still stuff I would prefer to do and I have the most skills in. So I think I would still say aim for whatever it is to be your thing you work on the most. I just don't like the word kind of specialist, because specialist really does feel limiting in this day and age when there's just so many people to hire. Why would I hire somebody who by design is telling me they can only do one thing, when you could have someone who's good at X but is open to being good at other things,
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I would say whatever it is that you're applying for, though, just make sure that you customize everything in your application to that position, right? Like if it's a job that needs some specific specialization or some skills that you have, make sure that you're highlighting and focusing on those skills, and don't focus on and highlight a bunch of crap that they don't care about. If it's
at a minimum,
job, don't show them your Unreal. Go ahead.
At a minimum, have a custom cover letter, because that is like the instant in the bin for me. If someone posts a resume and the letter is, "Hello, I want to work at your company. I like working and experience. I'm motivated." You're like, you have no idea who we are. This letter has gone to a million companies and you've no idea, and there's no indication that you even want to work here. You're just sort of putting test feelers out to see what happens. At a minimum, if you have in an ideal world, you would customize your resume for each different job you're requesting. But again, being a student, I also sent out hundreds of resumes at one stage. I know that's not practical. But what I did do is I wrote just a blurb, a little paragraph to each company to say, "Hey, X company, I would love to work with you. I know you do." And I just Google them, look at their website and go, "I know you do X technology on Y kind of projects. I'd like to work on that." And just do that for each company you're sending the thing. If you're going to the effort of printing out resumes, either mailing them or delivering them, take the extra few minutes to make it look like something that is to the person that you're actually talking to.
Oh, definitely. And don't tell them what you want, right? Like, that's I think one of the best pieces of advice in that cover letter. If your cover letter is just telling them what you want, or you put some objective on what you want, like, there's zero people that care. Like people don't go around looking at resumes saying like, oh, well, what does this person want? Let's find the person who wants the coolest thing. They want to know like what you can do for the company and how you can help the company, how you can contribute to the team, and how choosing you is a good choice. And that's what you need to get across in your cover letter and in your resume, not a, I want to one day do this, or I want to, I want to use this job as a stepping stone to start my own company, or I want to one day go work for Blizzard after I work for you for a little while. Like that stuff's all terrible. I recommend the book How to Win Friends and Influence People. Go through that book. There's a good section on exactly that. Every time I go for a long drive, I just listen to audiobooks and I just replay that one and other things. So it's a good one on. It talks quite a bit about getting jobs and being hired and remembering to be able to see things from the employers or the interviewer's perspective, which is going to be two people, right? It's going to be the people that are actually hiring you, and then the people that are forced to sit there and interview you that don't want to interview you. You got to remember that you're dealing with both of those groups of people, and make sure that you take into account what's going on in their head when you're talking, and not ruin it for yourself. Right? It makes
and that comment you made about what they want versus what you want, that's like, if this isn't even just about jobs or about people, this is, if there is the one biggest mistake people make in life, it's that you want things. Everyone wants stuff. You either want someone to hire you, or you're convincing people of things. That's your life goal in most scenarios. You want to play games with a friend, you want to convince them to join you. Like, everything is subtly about decision making and trying to convince people of your side. And most people make their sales pitches on, come on, it would be cool, I really want to. And it's like, who cares? Like, the people you will never win someone to an argument by saying what you want. And this is such a common mistake on literally everything. People will sell you on ideas by how much it benefits them. And it's such a small mental switch. But if you approach everything as, well, why would they say yes? It's actually perfectly justifiable for them to say no, because I'm not making a good offer. So if you ask yourself, how will their life improve as a result of either hiring you or playing games with you or lending you money? How will that benefit them? If the pitch is, can you lend me $5? I'll give you back 12. As silly as that sounds, that's like, the pitch is, you will get a return on your investment. That's not what you don't sell it on, I will buy X with it. No one cares, right? So no matter what it is, from the smallest thing in your life to the biggest, if you're trying to convince people, like, again, put yourself in their shoes and try to make it a compelling offer that you would want to accept.
Yeah. I mean, just to be clear with everyone, the reward doesn't always have to be some financial thing, like you're getting the money. It could just be the reward of, like, you got to help a friend and it was an easy thing to do, or it was, that friend is going to help you sometime in the future and you've built up a little bit of goodwill. It could be any number of different things that are motivating people to do stuff. You want to make sure that you're just looking at those when you're going into these interviews, and when you're trying to motivate them to hire you, try to actually motivate them to hire you. Don't beg them to hire you. Don't say like, hey, please hire me because nobody else hired me and everything's terrible, and if you don't hire me then nobody will and my life's gonna suck. Like, that sounds totally miserable, and it's not going to convince anybody, right? It's just going to make them think like, okay, nobody hired you because there must be a reason, so they all have some justification, and you're just kind of arguing against yourself and fighting against yourself at that point. You really want to just find what you think you can offer and then present that and make the best argument for it.
And even that, like, you're talking about hiring, and just to be clear, you're right. It's not about finances either. Like, for example, I early in my career, I would just reach out to people. I would just make a point of sending people DMs and messages. And as you know, they probably get a lot of them. You don't want to just be more noise. And so I would always, before I send someone a message, I would, like, for example, if it's on Reddit and there's someone who posted something cool on Reddit and I wanted to work on their project, I'd go through their history, look at what they're posting and what they're doing. And if they're on a project, and sometimes you'll see a posting that says, looking for an artist or looking for sound design or something like that. Or if not, you'll just see them making some projects and you can look through a bunch of their stuff. And then if you notice a flaw, if you notice something, like in my case, oftentimes interaction systems are done badly. They're just, a lot of people, when they make early projects, they just use raycasts or other very simple approaches that make things very finicky and require like specific click accuracy that just makes games not feel good. And so that to me is like, yes, free hook. Here's a thing they clearly don't know how to do as well as I do. And so I can reach out to them, not to tell them they're wrong, but to say, hey, I love your stuff. I had a few ideas how to make the interaction better. You could do X, Y, and Z, and then, if you want, I could help you with it. Simple. You're not reaching out. What you're actually saying is, I want you to pay me to work for you. But that's not what you're saying. What you're saying is, I have benefit. I'm right here. If you ever want to hire me, you will get benefit for your project by hiring me. I'm just here as an offer of value to you,
Yeah. That's great. And you're coming in exactly with how you can help and how you can solve the problem and the problem that they actually have. So I think it's good stuff, man. I don't know. There are a lot of questions popping up in chat too. I don't know if you wanted to hop into some of those, or I feel like we could talk about getting jobs forever though.
We could, yeah. I will say one last note though, is there is a fair comment to be made that the person with the most experience may seem like they'll get the job. I would say no, not from my experience. The person with the most experience goes to the top of the list almost consistently, but what happens is they're a good candidate. But once you get into the room with somebody, like, again, you're hiring the person you want to work with on a regular basis. And so I have turned down candidates considerably more experienced simply because they look like they'd be a struggle to work with. I'm not even talking about bad personalities. I just mean the way they communicate is too literal, or they don't seem like they have a good grasp of how to deal with the business side of things, or the way they're responding is sort of like they're doing a yes and on what I say. I've noticed that on some people. You'll talk about something and you'll say some like feature or idea, and they go, yeah, and you could do all of this stuff, and you're like, well, okay, this is a hypothetical scenario where I've almost given you requirements, and you ignored everything I said. You didn't press for further details, and you started going off on a tangent of cool technologies you could add to the project. You may be really skilled, but if I get the hint that you're going to effectively not be a good person to work with because you're not going to understand how to provide value to me as a client, a junior person, if anything, is going to be the opposite. They're going to be more eager to please. They're going to try their best to make the thing that you want because that's how they get to keep their job. So sometimes junior people are actually better because they're more willing to learn for what you want rather than the experienced person who's going to come in and tell you what you want. And that can be very frustrating. So yeah, not always, not from my experience.
Yeah, I would say I generally agree. And I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of the testing that we do in interviews is kind of to see how people solve problems and how they react to things, and less on what they actually know. It's kind of hard to test exactly what people know, and it's a lot easier to test how they're going to respond like day to day when problems come up at work and stuff. And I found that how you respond in between interactions with interviewers also can make a big difference too. So if you've had an interview, you've had an email interaction with them, and there's anything that you can do to follow up and make that better, do it. If you've had a phone call and after the phone call something pops up that you think of that you think would add to it or make it even better, like email them and let them know. Like, keep in contact. And same with like after an interview, like if you are more likely to, the more you reach out and the more you make contact with them and just update them on things or correct things, if you're wrong about something and you figure out the solution, the more likely you are to get into a position. It's one of the few things that like I regret not doing a very, very long time ago. So, because I've done this multiple times, and every time I've done it, it's gotten me the job, except for the one time I didn't do it. So I'll just talk about it real quick. So long time ago, I applied for a position working on Vanguard, working on that video game, and I went down there. I probably told this before, but I went down there, flew down to Las Vegas, had an interview, and it was great. Like, overall, I thought it was good. I thought I was going to get the job. It's like, okay, this is awesome. Seems like I'm very likely, and not 100%, but I thought, like I got at least like a 70-80% chance of getting this job. Like, it seemed really cool. I was really into it, and I felt like I was somewhat qualified, right? And I got along with the guys great. And I left, went home, and just kind of sat around and waited. And like a week went by and I didn't hear anything. And then another week went by and I didn't hear anything. And then like 2 more weeks went by and I was like, well, this sucks. Like, I guess I'm not getting that job. And then I started looking and like, there was just nothing. I had never heard a word back from it. But what I didn't do the whole time was actually reach out to anybody and email them and ask them about it. I did nothing. I was totally silent on it, just assuming that, hey, this was an opportunity. I guess I screwed it up. I guess it didn't work. Now, if I contrast that to every other time that I've had it, every other time I've run into a situation where I didn't hear back right away after an interview, is normally with an interview, I'd go to an interview or have a phone interview and either hear right away, like, hey, we'd like to move on to the next step, or hey, we don't think this is going to be the right fit. Every other time that I didn't, that hasn't happened, what I usually do is just email them and call them and say, hey, thank you for the opportunity, or hey, thanks, that was a lot of fun. I think I messed up one thing on the call and I found a better solution. I think that this is what I would recommend in general. Just wanted to let you know. And again, thanks for the opportunity. Every time I've done that, which has been 3 times, went right in. They're like, hey, that was great. And then I talked to them afterwards, like, yeah, when you sent that email, I was like, yeah, we're going to hire this guy instead. I was like, okay, cool. I was like, awesome. Because I'd become friends with the people after you get hired by me. And every time they told me that. The time that I didn't do it, had I done it, I probably would have got the damn job too. The problem was that the guy that I was talking to left the company like a week after.
I said that. Yeah.
I left. I didn't know that had happened. I had no idea the internal politics. Otherwise, I probably still could have gotten into that job and had a game dev job a couple years earlier than I got into it. I mean, to be fair, I would have missed out on working at Intel and learning a lot of code stuff, and I might have ended up being a game designer instead of a programmer. So it probably worked out in the end. And I'm good with it. But it was still a very interesting thing for me. Like, just remembering that you're still dealing with people, and if you mess up and you just be honest about it and correct yourself, it really generally usually pays off. I mean, people prefer honesty over bullshit all the time. And if you just sit in an interview and try to bullshit people and pretend that you know things, and then you try to bullshit them afterwards, people can tell. Like, you're not fooling anyone. They might sit there and pretend that they believe you and that you're not full of crap, but that's just to be nice to get you out of there so that you'll stop. Right? It's not because they actually believe it. So just be honest.
And again, there's a difference between people. Like, people always worry about being overeager. Well, I mean, I think anybody who truly feels that way hasn't really stopped and just put themselves in the person's shoes. Like, there is a difference between being overeager and like generally just being enthusiastic. Like, something very similar that I do is, well, one, if I ever have a question and I get it wrong in an interview, I will always stop and ask them, what's the right answer? Because it's such a small thing, but just by asking, it means you're implying you actually care to learn to get better. And even if you get it wrong and they're like, oh, cool, they're actually curious as to what the right answer is. If you don't ask that, then it's like, oh, they just don't care that they got it wrong, right? The other one too, which is very similar to what you said, which is kind of funny. If I have a conversation and it brings up something, this is a small subtle trick that I do. If the conversation came up and we're talking about solving some technical problem, I will go and gather some resources I've had or that I've looked at before, and I'll send them like a follow-up email or something, kind of like you're saying. But I would say, oh, hey, just as a side note, that was a really fun conversation. I read a couple of articles about that a few weeks back. Here you go. Good luck. And I wouldn't even mention it from a job perspective. It would just be I am so interested in the topic we discussed. I just happen to be researching it. And by the way, here's some more stuff. Or even if it's not about the work, if you bring up a fun conversation, like sometimes in the middle of the interview, you'll bring up a book or an author or a comic book or some movie that you kind of like as part of a conversation. If there's a fun resource about that thing, some cool YouTube video or something, I will send it on to them. And it may seem completely arbitrary, but if you want to be remembered, imagine having a conversation with 50 different candidates. One of them, you have a fun side joke about your favorite Marvel hero, and they send you an email afterwards going, by the way, this video is awesome. Here's a thing about this character. If they're not interested, they'll delete it. But if they do, it makes you very memorable. And it also is like, it comes across earnestly, like you actually giving them something they would enjoy, separately from the cartoonishly fighting for a job mentality. So it's about the earnestness of it. Like, it's not everyone knows you're trying to put your best foot forward. That nobody's lying to each other. Everyone in that room is putting on some airs. The person who's in the seat is pretending to be more serious than they really are. The person who's being interviewed is trying not to panic and say something stupid. So people afterwards will give you a bit more leeway than you think they will. The environment of an interview tends to be a lot more clinical than real life. And so once the interview's over and everyone's chilled out and had their coffee and gone back to their desk, if they see an email of something fun as a direct result of that conversation, usually goes down well.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think being that outside the interview room experience adds a lot. It's always nice too if you get a chance to have an interview and go to lunch with the guys. whoever's interviewing you, if you can go out with that team of people that's interviewing you and talk to them, and you're able to do it calmly and just talk about things that are not too serious, it tends to break the ice a lot, especially if you can find something that you're both interested in. That's the best. Like, you find a topic that you're interested in, they're interested in, that's not necessarily work that you're very good at or very into. Could be, sports or some game or some other type of thing. A game is very often one I've seen, people just like, they both really love the same game, like some subset of people on the team, like that's the game they play and they happen to play it all the time. Works out great. And I also think that your mention on asking the answer is extremely important, because it does show that you're interested and that you care, and that when you don't know things, you actually want to find the answer to it. And it's also extremely important so that when they ask you the question in the next interview, you have a good idea of a good answer, right? Like, you have an idea of like where to look and what people are thinking and what they're looking for. I've been in interviews. Okay, I remember I went on an interview at Riot. They asked me questions. It was a really weird one, though. They asked me questions that were a lot of brain teaser ones. It was all like riddles, right? The first one, I was like, I don't know. I think like I knew like maybe 1 out of 4 of the riddles, right? And the next team came in, and they did the same thing. And like half of them, I was like, I think I know this one because I just did it. The next team came in, same thing. It was literally like they got like three groups or 4 groups that asked me the same questions multiple times, like the same exact interview questions, and it just reminded me that, hey, like, knowing the answers to these things in advance. I mean, part of it was just they weren't really in a hiring mode at that time for what I was trying to apply for. They were growing so fast that like people are not really prepared for it, and the guys that were doing the stuff that I was going to go in for weren't actually there. So it just happened to be like a bad time for it, and I was totally unprepared, and I did terrible on my interview too. So it was a big combination. And riddle questions, those things drive me nuts. I'm so bad at those.
Yeah,
like
especially with the stress of it, man. Yeah, I don't really like those. I'm the kind of person who would do those for fun. But the problem is, when you're in the middle of a stressful job interview, it's like, quick, show that you've got critical reasoning skills. It can be very daunting.
Yeah, I hate it. And for me, it was just like, it all just came down to a question of like, have you seen this problem or something similar before and been doing it recently? And the answer to that was like, no, not at all. So it was interesting, but I always asked at the end, like, how do you do this? Can you explain it? Because I was really curious and I wanted to know, like, well, what is the reasoning here? And sometimes I was like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was like, I don't know, I don't even know how I can get that. And a lot of times I was like, yeah, I probably wasn't going to figure that out, but that is interesting. But then I knew it for the next question or the next interview, or literally I'd gone on interviews afterwards and I'm like, I actually remember that because I failed it twice at Riot. Like, now I know. Now I've got it down. So it was good advice, at least. Ask the questions and find out how to do things that you don't know how to do. I think it's really important. And I've valued that a lot when people were doing it in our own interviews. Like when I'm giving interviews, if I ask people to do something and they don't know how to do it and they don't seem interested in knowing how to do it and it's part of the job, it's a big red flag. Right?
It's actually very funny you say that, because I was doing an interview with somebody 5 days ago, and I had my sheet of these are the questions I'm asking. Here's the technologies I want to see them answer, and it's amazing seeing people dance around the questions you ask, like just desperately avoid. They don't have the answers to the technologies you're saying, and it's pretty transparent pretty quickly when people they don't have the abilities that you're asking for.
Yeah, well, I think the other thing that's important, and I was actually just talking to my wife about this, is just being honest when you don't know things too. Because if you don't know the answer to
100%,
stuff,
you're allowed to not know the answer.
Yeah, and tell the truth, like, and then find the answer. She was asking me earlier about in the Q&A calls, because I was talking to her. I was like, yeah, well, we do the live Zoom call, and then she's like, but what if they ask you a question you don't know the answer to? And I was like, well, then I say, I don't know the answer. We'll see if we can figure it out, and I'll ask if anybody else on the call happens to know the answer. And she's like, how do you do that? Well, yeah, you just got to be honest. I mean, I think when you're honest about what you know and don't know, people are a lot more forgiving than when you try to pretend you know things that you don't know and that you understand things. It never pays off, and people can tell, and it's always bad. I've run into a lot of people where I talk to them and they're trying to tell me something as if they know it, and like I'm at the point where I know that they're just lying to try to save face, and it's like it's not working. I mean, at that point, just let them keep going, but yeah, it doesn't pay off. Just be
Plus,
honest
I mean,
about it.
it is a cliche too that a lot of this comes down to confidence. Like it comes down to how confident you are during the interview, and you can't. It's very hard to fake that. The truth is, I've gotten better over time with interviews, not because, well, obviously partially because I'm better at what I'm doing, but more so because, for example, I used to get asked questions like, do you know this technology or can you use it? And I would have that same gut wrenching fear of, oh no, I don't know how to do this. I'm not qualified. That sinking feeling would happen, and you'd start stammering your words, and you're trying to come up with answers, and you don't know what to do. These days, I've worked on enough projects where I didn't know the answer or the technology when you start, but then partially through it, I stop and go. They say, "Oh, do you know this technology?" And it's like, no, but I can learn it. I've been on projects that I've done stuff like that. I haven't used that exact stack or library or whatever, but like I've many times have I thought that I couldn't do it, and I was ready to turn down a job, but somebody else forced me to take it, and within a week I could do that job. And so after a while, I sort of came to the conclusion: it's like, well, maybe it's not about, you don't have to know everything. Like, of course, you haven't covered every single technology ever made ever, but can you honestly say, do you think you could learn it? And if I can say confidently and honestly, yeah, I don't know it right now, but I've used if I've done my homework enough to know the name of the technology and what roughly it is, what area it's in, I could say, oh, or even just do a Google, literally on my phone. Sometimes if I ask for a technology, I'm like, I don't know, and so I just type it in and I go, oh right, it's this kind of technology. I haven't used that one specifically, but I've used stuff like it, and then you can kind of ramble on the philosophy of it, and then they're like, oh, okay, like you don't need to know all the answers. You just need to be able to be willing to learn it, providing that they have time for that.
Yeah, and pretending you know them just doesn't work. Like, it makes me, whenever anybody tells me that they know everything, I just assume that they're making stuff up. That they probably don't really. It makes me wonder how much they know of any of the one thing. They tell me that like they know every single thing. I'm like, I wonder like how light is that knowledge in every area. It just does, it has to be believable, and I just stick with keeping it honest. There was a mention here. I just wanted to mention on that last comment about someone found it odd that interviewers always ask about tech, so like specific tech instead of kind of underlying and bigger concepts. And I think that's interesting too, but I think that there's a good reason for it, and it's just that it's the easiest thing to ask about, and it's also like the beginning prereq, right? I think that before you get to the underlying concepts part, the part where do you understand like how to build a thing or how to get this job done, and all of the parts involved, you still need to make sure that they understand like the very basics and the fundamental technology. Like, can they read and write the programming language that you're working in? Can they, navigate around the editor and create a thing or whatever it is that they need to do? That's easy to test, and it's kind of the prereq. And I think that the concept part usually just doesn't even happen. It's just that it just gets left out because like it's too hard to do, and it's after that other prereq. What are your thoughts on that? Like on just testing or on the bigger stuff?
So I tend to go for the concept stuff because this maybe it's just arrogance on my part, but because I've been doing so much tutoring in my life, usually when people start talking about a subject, I can ask more probing questions to figure out where I feel that they're weak on, and I can normally get to the right answers by inspecting them. So I don't normally need the technical questions when I do interviews, but I would say, to be fair to people, the reason why you would want to do more practical ones, it actually gives you more information than you think it will. So, great example. Somebody mentioned SQL. Any programmer who's been working in enterprise stuff for any length of time, even a year or probably less, you would have done some SQL. Like SQL, it's needed for stuff. Even if it's just the basic select star from table, right? Even if it's the most fundamental statement, you probably have know some SQL. But the thing is, if they ask you a specific question and you don't know the syntax offhand, it doesn't actually matter that you don't know the syntax. It matters that you're in the ballpark. So I was on one job interview before where I came out of college and they asked me, how would you select all users with a certain age from a database? And it's like, select star from where, whatever. And it's like, oh, what if you wanted to join that on their grades? Okay, you do a join on this table with probably is a primary key. And I was like, I don't remember the exact thing. Is it primary key join or is it just like quotes? But they were like, they already went, that's fine. The fact that you know that's probably a primary key, the fact that you vaguely understand that there's a where clause, the fact that you use the word join to indicate you know what it is or you know it's grouped by, they're not actually testing. They're not testing for correctness of your statement. They're testing the difference between you saying, I've done some SQL, which basically means I've been on projects where it's in front of me and I've had a Google Sheet up in front of me and I've kind of roughly changed some words versus I know it enough to reason it out. I just don't remember the syntax offhand. So I find it's actually a very big difference between somebody who can say with confidence the words around the topic. Like, again, I know a lot of buzzwords about programming stuff like polymorphism and covariance and contravariance, and I can go into all of this stuff. And I don't expect most people to do that because even if you know the concepts, you may not know the words. But if I ask them about the concept and they give me, isn't that the thing that roughly has to do with generics and how they go in and out of whatever? It's like, you know enough that you understand vaguely it, and like this isn't a school quiz to test your correctness on stuff. But I now know you've at least looked into it yourself. You've actually at some point read something with that word on the page, and that tells me that it's somewhere there in the back of your head, and that's all I really need. So I think technical interviews are often less about did they get the right answer, unless you're hiring for some algorithmic dev where you're trying to see if they're good at optimizing things or catching weird puzzles. But in most cases, it's probably just, do they know how to do the stuff? Or even if they don't, do they know enough about it that they're like on the right track? That means that the time it would take to get them from confused to proficient is a lot smaller than somebody who never actually took the time to commit it to memory. And even though they worked on it, they always had a guidebook or something beside them.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've met a lot of people who kind of struggle with that and they get kind of mixed up in those interviews with the questions and instead just freak out. So I don't know. It's sorry. I want to jump onto this question real quick. So, because we're talking about just coding in general, and in these interviews and stuff, it kind of popped in to make me think about like the types of things that we actually check for and how much stuff people actually need to know. So if you're getting, so I don't know exactly how I want to ask this question, but when we go into like these technical interviews and we're asking like the more technical questions on C# stuff and programming sides in general, because I mean the SQL stuff I've had plenty of times, but it's always been in that same scenario of like, do you understand the basics? And I didn't have to understand. I kind of write it and then use the query editor or something, and then that would tell me the exact version and fix my syntax. But when we get into the C# stuff, there's a lot that I think people get quizzed on and questioned on in interviews that sometimes just is either not required or goes beyond what average people are using. And sometimes I think at the beginner level, especially, generics and lambdas can kind of fall into that, or at least they could, back a long time ago, and I wonder how much that's changed. So I mean,
wait, you're telling me you don't quiz your news people on bitwise flags for enums? No, you don't make sure that they can do their own off the top of their head entire bitwise flag calculation.
No, but I've seen it, and I wonder, like, and I always thought that those kinds of questions, and even these kinds of questions, were not very, very helpful because there would always be like these advanced C# or advanced math features that if you knew it, like it solves the one problem for like that one very specific scenario, but it doesn't apply to what you're doing like day to day. So I guess I don't know. I at the beginner level. Go ahead.
I was gonna say my version of that is I absolutely hate either getting or being part of an interview where someone asks about the correct sorting algorithms, because it's such a stupid question to ask somebody. Because if they say, "Oh, what sorting algorithm would you use here?" and I've actually had this conversation. I've sat down with somebody who hires people. This is when I was younger, and they kind of tested me and said, "Okay, out of curiosity, what would you say to this question?" And I said, "I would use dot sort." And he's like, "See, I wouldn't hire someone who said that." And I would say, "And you'd be wrong, because you didn't give me requirements. You didn't tell me whether this is going to be a huge collection or not." Now, in a real interview, I would be quizzing you more. I'd be asking, is it a big system? Is it going to be lots of people? Are we going to be, what's the most common task we're doing? Are we searching by name? Are we looking things up? Like, there's a million questions. But if you tell me, what algorithm would you use for sort? I will give you the answer to the quickest thing to get it done, to give you a prototype, to give you more information, to help give me more information to do our job better. So the right answer is the quickest thing, so we can both keep going and keep working and making progress. And I think that the problem is, he was looking for the right answer. And I was saying, well, the right answer is what gets us getting this done. That's a different conversation. And so that one always stuck with me as an interesting one, because, like, if someone asks me what sorting algorithm to use, I would ask, I don't know the name specifically of which one, but I understand that there are different algorithms. There are different ones you can pick for divide and conquer solutions. There's ones that favor different log notation for different lookup types. And I would ask you what we need most, and I would pick the best one. I would do my homework, I would Google it, and I would find an algorithm that works. Me knowing offhand, memorized 15 algorithms that I can write from scratch is not what you want. You don't want me wasting brain power on memorizing quiz questions. You want me actually trying to solve your problem. And the way I do that is I find out your problem, I find out online what the solutions available are, and I try to find one that fits. And if it doesn't fit, I know enough code to make it fit the solution, the problem we have. So that's the one that bothers me the most, when you start getting arbitrary questions on memorizing algorithms.
Yep, I remember those. That was interview 3 at Qualcomm, algorithm stuff. And I remember that was the one I was like, I don't know. I was like, if I'm going to fail anything at this interview, it's going to be this one. And I had the luck of the guy who was giving it to me had just graduated from college, and he was specializing in algorithm stuff, and had just finished a class on it. So he was very fresh on it, but also very forgiving, because he realized that he's a really cool guy. Ankit, I got to hit him up again sometime. But yeah, he was very forgiving on my failure of most of those, and I answered a lot, I'd say, very similar to how you would. And it's the truth. I mean, if I have to sort something, I'm going to do sort or order by. And if that's not fast enough, then I'll find a solution, and I'll figure out the solution for why it's not fast enough, whether it's the type of data that I've got, or the amount of data, or the speed, or the how often I'm doing this thing, or whatever it is. And then I'll figure out the solution for that. And it could be a variety of different options or solutions depending on what the problem is. So I think that is amazingly good advice. Now, what about on these two things that just happen to be on the screen, generics and lambdas? I use them all the time, but as a new developer, I never used them at all. So when I was beginning and starting out, they were very, I think, foreign and not very common. And I think that has changed, though. I think that the entire ecosystem and the environment has changed, and that they're much more common and much more required in even entry-level development now, that you should expect to see generics and some lambdas, but maybe not be an expert at them.
So here's my hot take. If I was judging two people side by side, and somebody opted not to use any of the complicated tools and just use the stuff they're confident in, and somebody else did try to go for generics and lambdas and stuff, and they did anything wrong, I'm going to judge that person a hell of a lot harder. Because if you are ballsy enough to answer the question by genericizing out and making your abstract classes and using type of, and doing different things for that, I'm going to stop and go, okay, you've opened this can of worms. If you think you're ready to use these tools, the reason why, and it's not just about me being harsh, the person who's trying all of the tricks without having taken the time to understand them are the people who are going to bork your code base, because they're going to start making messy, complicated decisions. They're trying to look smart, and they're not going to actually solve problems. The people who are walking slowly and trying to make sure they know what they're doing are people that I can teach complicated things to. But the people who are doing it the wrong way means I have to basically unteach what they have already. And oftentimes that's harder work to do. And so I find, and I say this because that's who I was. I was the guy who would go into job interviews and be smarmy and like show off all the cool tricks I could do. And in retrospect, I look back at that and I would go, I wouldn't do that again. And I would probably, I'd probably be much more careful because a lot of this stuff, like for example, I might know the syntax for using generics, but I would be using them in a way which is pointless. For example, people who put interfaces on every single class because interfaces are abstract or vague and people need them. And if I see classes like dog with an interface attached to it and there's no inheriting anything, then I'm going to judge that person extremely harshly because that means they're excited enough to read the books, but they're not slowing down to learn them. And so, yeah, I guess the answer is, again, you're allowed to not know things. And over time, you will find problems that need solutions and you will learn new tools and eventually you'll get good at them. So I tend to realize that a lot of the stuff that I rushed to learn, I didn't actually learn when I thought I did. It wasn't until practical situations came up that I really understood them. So I really don't recommend people like race to the answers or try to learn complicated tools anymore. I would say use the tools you can. And if you ever see something that looks more elegant than what you're doing, if you know how to do it the unelegant way and you see an elegant solution that does the same thing, it's very easy to go, oh, that's just this, but with different syntax. And then you'll understand it because it directly matches and solves problems you have. So, yeah, in other words, don't worry. I wouldn't bother unless you're actively like again, if someone's showing off with them, I will consider that considerably worse. I show off with them because I can confidently say when I know them, if there's still tools I won't use that I understand, but I won't use them because I don't know if I'm using them right yet. And so I would say that's just a good caution to have in general.
Yeah, with generics, I'd say that's especially true. Usually when people learn about generics, they start looking for places to put it. And I would say that it's important to understand how they work and be able to read them so that when you see a system that's using generics, you can use it properly. So I would recommend that everybody kind of go through the process of creating a generic class, using it in something, and just at least understanding loosely how it works and how you're already using it with collections. But I wouldn't try to just shove it in places. It ends up doing exactly what you're talking about. I mean, I've done the exact same thing many times. I think right when I first found out about generic stuff that I could genericize everything, I was like, oh yeah, let's do that. I spent a whole bunch of time and energy genericizing stuff so I wouldn't have to spend any time and energy doing other things. And it just made stuff more complicated and harder. It didn't actually save time. Lambdas, that said, though, there are definitely good use cases for generics. It's just that once you get more comfortable with them, they'll start to kind of naturally appear and you'll see them. You'll say, oh, wait, I'm doing this thing for these different types of objects or these different types of data. Maybe there's some generic option here, and you start to think about it. But lambdas, I think, they're definitely something that you should understand earlier than later. Like I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you're using them all the time, but at the very least, like you're going to be using the extension methods on collections and things, the IE enumerable collections and lambdas and links and stuff on there. So you should at the very least be able to read and write lambdas and understand how the parameters are working and being passed in. I wouldn't use them as like your default way for writing code again, unless it makes it easier to read and easier to understand. But you should definitely use them in some scenarios and understand them so that when you want to sort something, you've got a list of 10 things and you want to order them by something, that that's an option, that you don't have to write out a method that does it in a class and go find this thing. You can just use some of the built-in stuff that's there. It's going to save you a ton of time, and it'll save you time in an interview. If I see somebody, I'm like, hey, I've got 100 things here at the beginning of the game. I need to order them by like which one was killed last in the last game. How can I do that? If you can tell me that you can just use an order by and grab that field, but good. You're not going to waste a day trying to figure out how to do something that already exists and has no performance downside. So I'd say,
and if you're going down that road, start with delegates first. By the way, if you are doing that, lambdas are just a confusing wrapper around the concept of delegate. So if you're trying to learn what the hell lambdas are, take a step back and just learn general events and delegates and move in that direction, and you'll get there eventually.
Yeah.
I would say that, like, you bring up a good point about the code clarity stuff, and I think a good example for me is that I showed you that code I wrote, the tiny potion example thing I did, and that to me is almost a good example of where the line is, because a lot of the stuff I've done in that tiny project is a little bit over the top for kind of syntactic sugar. Like there's stuff in there like custom object initializer syntax and custom indexers and implicit conversion and stuff that you don't need to know, but just make the code a bit nicer to work with. And so I think that highlights the difference, that the concepts that I wrote for that little project are no different than what anyone else would write, building just a list of potions and applying stuff and whatever. But the syntax, all it does is give you a nicer way to work with it. And so I would say that I wouldn't worry about needing that stuff. Oftentimes it just basically makes your code cleaner, which is good to have. But if you can't write good code in the first place, making it cleaner doesn't really get you anywhere, you know?
Yeah. It's got to work first and be good. Keep it simple. And that's one of the things I think is important too, is just keeping the code as simple as possible to get the job done. And something that I used to do the opposite of back in the day. It's like, hey, the more advanced this code is, the better. Look at all these files in here. I remember like the first time I compiled Unreal, I was like, this is so cool. I just compiled like 100,000 files and a couple million lines of code. And it got all excited. Now just like, I want to keep things as simple as possible to get the job done and make it work, because I remember now what it's like to actually have to go in and maintain and manage all that stuff and to deal with all of the edge cases when things don't work and when things change. So keeping it simple is like my number one rule. Like start simple and only make things more complex as the necessity comes, and don't pre-plan. Don't overdo things in advance. Don't make a generic wrapper for controllers when you're going to have 4 fucking controllers. Stop doing it, Jason. So yeah, it's been a long lesson for me.
Yeah, it is. I gotta say, there's something that is always fun when you open up an old project, and it used to be I would write complicated code and I'd come back and I assumed I'd be impressed when I come back to older complicated code. But the truth is, what really happens is you open an old project and go, oh yeah, I did something like this before. I have some code which does this thing, and you open it and go, oh great, I don't know how this works. It's hella complicated. There's a ton of stuff going on here. I can't reuse it, which defeats the point of making it modular in the first place. I'm out. I'll just do it again from scratch. But there's other times you open up a project and you're like, oh god, I haven't worked on this project in 3 months, but the client wants to re-release it with a new language pack or something. So you open it and you're like, please tell me I wrote this in a good way. And you open it and you're like, oh great, I immediately understand it. So good. It's just like, it is a set of chapters. The things are called chapter 1 to 5. I open the chapter. There's stuff called sections. Each section has a portion where it says, set up this, do this. And it's like, okay, there's a section called set language. Maybe I'll go into that. Oh, look, there it is. Perfect. Exactly what I need to change. And it's so much better if you try not to be too smart for your own good.
Yeah. And having good naming, super, super important for that stuff. Naming all that stuff exactly what it is. And then I think on top of the code part, you're kind of mentioning it there, you're talking about folder structure too, right? Like scene hierarchy and stuff. Having that not suck is extremely important too. Having a nice, clean layout where you can find things, and anybody who's looking at your project that's a developer can look at it and say like, oh yeah, I can kind of figure this out. And they don't go like, oh, what the hell is this? That's what you want to avoid, right? You want to have it make it easy to jump into and easy to get into. There are a lot of questions popping up. I don't know if we should just start taking some. There was one that I figured I would pop up for you though. And then maybe we'll just open it up and see if people have any other just game development questions, Unity questions, or other stuff. We'll start diving into them. So this one was, would you ever consider doing a code review like you do on Infallible Code, but reviewing some of your own, mine or Charles's, just to learn from some,
I love doing code reviews.
Some other people's code.
I don't mind. I happily do any code reviews. I love doing code reviews. So if anybody has code they want reviewed, just let us know. If you give us a bit of time in advance, we can set it up with a screen share and go through it.
Yeah, maybe just if somebody's got some, email it over to me and Jason. We can take a peek and see if we can figure some out. Or maybe I'll give Jason something later on this week too.
Or alternatively, you can just open up my GitHub and you can review my code. That'd be another fun one.
And go into there. That's an option too. I go in there, I'm going to go, I don't understand any of this. It's too complicated, Jason. The one thing that does get me, though, is the damn custom indexers all the time. Like, I forget that they exist. And, like, Wait, why is this working? Oh shit, there it is. That's the one thing that'll catch me every now.
The one that I know catches people that I use, and I admit it's the one thing, the one sort of thing in my code that I admit is kind of, I know it'll trip people up, but I enjoy it because it still makes the code better, is whenever you do the object initializer syntax, you can pass in, so the classic one being you open the curly brackets and you can assign a bunch of values to it. There's also collection initializer syntax, and that's when you're doing lists or arrays, where instead of having to say new list and then dot add, you can do curly brackets and then create one in each thing. A lot of people are like, okay, cool. But then my scripts allow you to do that. I often write scripts where if it is a collection type, you will be able to use that syntax on my objects. And people are like, but how does that work? I don't understand. And there's no special thing in the code that lets you do that. It's actually a fun example of design by contract, where there's certain things in C# that people don't realize that are actually, they're not based on interfaces, they're language specification things. So for example, if a class returns an enumerator, it can be for eached, whether or not it has any particular special interface. It's this weird implicit thing. Any class with a function that returns an enumerator, the code will just let you for each on it. Now, that may return null and throw an error or whatever, but that's the only requirement to actually make it for eachable. And likewise, if you want to use the initializer syntax, it has to be of type IEnumerable and simply have a method called add. That's it. There's no special anything else. If there is a method called add on the object and it happens to implement IEnumerable, or IEnumerator, no, it is IEnumerable, sorry, then you can use the collection initializer syntax. So stuff like that can be very confusing to people, but I think the trade-off is worth it given how much nicer it makes the code.
You do have to implement that add though, right?
Yeah, but again, it's not, the add isn't on any interface. It's just if you write a method called public void add. That's all you do.
Okay. It just has to be there, but without, okay. Huh.
Yeah, in fact, actually, like I said, I'll show you the example because I have it on my the GitHub thing. But rather than me trying to explain it vaguely.
This is an interesting one. 1 second.
Yeah. Oh, sweating buckets here. It's a really warm day, and I don't appreciate it. Not with all of the computers and heavy equipment that's making the room hotter. How do you name objects in your hierarchy? Do you prefer to just keep it simple, like player health text? I do, but I find, so the thing is, I've said this before with the hierarchy as well as the project view. They're not folder structures. They look like folder structures, but that's just a side effect of it just being an asset database. And so you can actually, for example, in the tree structure that is the hierarchy, if you just write T:* TextMesh Pro or whatever, it'll find all of your TextMesh Pro objects. So you don't really need the folder structure of that to be, it doesn't really matter what it is. There is performance concerns with how your folder structure looks in the hierarchy. But in general, I don't take it too seriously. One thing I do like to do is I don't like to label things with the word label, or TextMesh Pros have the really long syntax. So I tend to just write LBL underscore or BTN, just because if I'm building UI components, it's nice to find the one that is the right. For example, you might have like a name input section, and there might be like 3 different things, the name label and the name input box, and they're both called name, and it might be hard to differentiate them. And I don't want to have name label, name input box, so I would just call it BTN, or sorry, LBL name and TXT name. It gives me the same information in a shorter amount of time. So that's about it. Other than that, one thing that does surprise people is I will often have a logic object. So I'll have a thing in the bottom of my project called logic in square brackets, and I will actually put most of the running scripts there. And that's my sort of cue to somebody that if they wanted to look at a scene, and this is kind of a thing that bothers me at least. If you open up a scene that you've not seen before, someone else's project, and you want to run it, and it starts throwing exceptions immediately, and you're like, ugh, I just want to see what this does, but I can't because stuff needs to be tied up. There needs to be some way I can very quickly get it back in a running state. So I always have a logic object with a bunch of scripts that are like the actual init scripts, the equivalent of the entry point for that object. And so if you want to test the scene without it breaking, you can just turn off the logic object and the rest of the scene will work. And it's a great way to sort of inspect what's going on. And what I do is I'll name the objects ridiculously long names.
I would call it like setting up the scene or loading the objects. And that might confuse some people, but I find if you've got a logic object with initializing blank, loading files, setting players or whatever, there's very little confusion as to what the hierarchy of things are and what they're doing. And again, you can turn that object on and off. That's about the one weird thing. Other than that, as far as naming conventions go, in the hierarchy, I like to have root objects with sub-objects that I call model. That's kind of a standard convention. If I have a player, the player character stuff would be under model. If I have a door that animates, I'd have a door with a door script on it, and the sub-object that's the mesh would be called model. I just keep that consistently across my entities. I think that's it. Do you have any specific naming convention patterns or practices you do?
I would say there's definitely a couple. When it comes to the editor stuff, I also generally like to have either a single object that has all of my logic stuff on it that's managing the game state, or an object that has child objects underneath it that are each managing an independent piece of the state. Just depending on whether or not I want to mix and match them, and whether or not I want those scripts to have some editor stuff on them, because sometimes there's some scenarios where it'll just end up very big and the script ends up too big with too many components. It just gets harder to manage. So I'll break it into separate little sub ones. When it comes to the naming of them, what I generally do, I have this weird convention that I like to use where I put big square braces around the types of important things and then make them all uppercase capitalized so that they really stand out in the hierarchy. And everything that has no code on it does nothing special. There's just a spawned object, just uses a very standard like Pascal case for the naming and spaces and everything. I never use underscores in there. And then when it comes to the custom things like the name or like the labels and the UI stuff like you're talking about, I generally do shorten them down, but I don't shorten them quite as much. I shorten them down to like label or text or input. So I won't get rid of the vowels, but I will get rid of the secondary and third words, or I'll put them down to TMP for text mesh pro text. If it's a text mesh pro one, I can just leave TMP. That works for me too.
The reason I do it that way, though, is I actually agree with you. I prefer label as opposed to LBL, but I do it for a very specific reason, which is if you keep a consistent prefix length, things line up better. So TXT, LBL, all of that stuff, it keeps everything aligned. It's a small thing, but I like to see them
I put mine at the end. That's probably why.
Okay,
yeah. I always put them at the end. I'll like name, label, name, text, whatever. That's probably the difference. Otherwise, I could see definitely doing that so that they keep that same length and same consistency. But yeah,
another one I do.
As you keep one or the other, whatever you do, just keep it consistent. Like make sure that you use something that your team and you will stick with, and don't mix it up.
Another one I do, actually, I just realized, coming to think of it, is another convention I do, which kind of throws people off a little bit, is now we haven't gotten into patterns for how you approach user interface stuff, but suffice it to say, while I don't do the full MVVM or any of that stuff, that's a whole different conversation. I do have separate views. Views are different in terms of how I approach it. And to me, a view is a script which interfaces with UI elements but doesn't perform any business logic. So, for example, you might have a component which is for like a login screen. And a login screen takes in, it provides you with a user's name, a user's password, and it has a button to fire an event to say login, right? That's the bits of information on a UI component. I don't want to do any logic in the code behind. There shouldn't actually be any API calls or web stuff out of that system from my perspective. So I use a prefix called UI underscore. And if I have any script that's got UI underscore written on it, what that means is this script doesn't do any work, but it just visually represents a piece of information. So UI underscore login will basically say, this provides me with a way of doing the UI portion of logging in. In other words, it's probably 2 input boxes and a button, but it mightn't be. It might be a voice panel that I press a button and it will read my voice and then type it into some input field. Or it might be a thing that lets me drop a text file on it and it turns into the fields for text and for password and name or whatever. It doesn't say what it does. It says it is the UI facing portion of a system that interacts with providing a view layer. So I do that as a thing. which can kind of get a bit confusing for people. But yeah, so UI underscore, if you see that in my code, it means this interfaces with the user, but doesn't actually do anything. It just wraps the information in a way that the rest of the systems can interact with it.
I used to do almost the exact same thing without the underscore. So I had UI and then whatever the class name was. I somewhat recently switched to just using, instead of using the UI there, I keep them in a separate folder and then use the word for the type of object that it actually is now. And I'm not 100% sure that I'm sold on the switch that I've made in my naming convention, but I like it so far. For instance, I'll name things like an inventory panel, and then that will be a UI script that shouldn't be doing anything other than interacting with and binding up to an inventory system, or a health bar script that just binds up to a bar, or to be a name label or something. It'll usually have the object type in the name as like the second part of the name. So it's been the new convention that I've somewhat recently switched to. And I don't really know what made me switch to it. I just kind of decided, I don't know that I...
Hey, so sometimes you just want a bit of novelty.
So I want to try it the other way. Like dying over here with these... I switched to my good morning drink of Rockstar and Sour Patch Kids. It's like snack time. Coding meal.
I've been carefully eating some chicken goujons on the side here with my
I saw your milkshake arrive. There were comments.
Yeah. Hey, the weather's really hot. Okay, like look at how red I am. I need something cool because this is ridiculous, and because it's so warm, I have to open the window. Oh yeah, I need to turn mine on. I don't know if you can see it behind me.
My fan right over there, blowing to keep me cool.
Here's my big fancy fan that I have. I just haven't turned the damn thing on because I can't find the power cable for it. So just figure wherever I put that.
Oh man. The weird thing, this thing actually came with this smaller massage thing. Because I don't know if I told you what this is. It's supposed to massage.
No, honestly, I thought it was a VR headset or something. I couldn't tell.
It literally, like, it massages the top of your head. It massages the front of your head. It massages the sides and the back and the neck and stuff. And I was like, well, my head always hurts and my neck always hurts, so whatever. But it came with this little portable one, and that thing is a huge hit. Like, even my wife likes it, which is weird because my wife, every time I try to massage her with something, she's like, get that off me. What are you doing? Stop. So she actually likes it. She's like, do it again. So I was like, oh yeah, I get to get another one of those. But this thing, here, watch. I'll turn it on real quick. We'll take another code question after I get some birds chirping in my ear. Can you hear the birds?
I can hear birds, yeah.
See? And it just goes and... squeezing my head. My eyeballs. My head is way too big. I don't know if did I tell you about the time I tried to go skydiving? Or like indoor skydiving? Yeah, it was
go for it.
Indoor skydiving because when they came out with the VR stuff. So they had the VR games where you could like basically fall and be in VR while you're like floating in this indoor skydiving thing, right? And my daughter really wanted to do that forever, and it's like, oh, they got a VR one. I was like, I got to try it out. I was like, this is something I have to do for work at the very least, right? I can make that excuse. So I was all excited, and I got down there, got all signed up, and we're waiting, and they're like, all right, time to go get your helmets on, right? So we go over there. My daughter gets her helmet, pops it on. It's got like the goggles. She's like, I don't like it. She didn't really like having the headset on. Just took it off and stuff. And was like, okay, whatever. She was still going to do it, right? Then they're like, okay, well, what one do you want? I was like, just give me the biggest one you got. Right, they gave me the biggest helmet they had, which was like a 2 or 3X. And it was like this, dude. This is about how far I could get it on my head. I was like, I couldn't even like get it to the point where the goggles were on touching my forehead. It was that small. I was like, holy crap. Yeah, it sucked. I've had that problem forever though. I got like a giant head. I should be like a cartoon character or something. It's the same thing when they go-kart racing. They'd have to like pull out the special helmet from the back. They'd be like, yeah, we got a guy who works here who's got a big helmet. I'll take that. Like, bring that thing in.
Well, if it's any consolation, I've got tiny feet. Apparently, I have a really hard time finding shoes because I have the smallest size but the flattest feet. So I've got this weird duck-shaped foot. So we're all broken in some way.
Yeah, I guess. all in different shapes. But yeah, I wish that thing was a tiny bit bigger. If they'd just make like a big head version, make one for like bears or something. I knew like
do seem like
the wildlife version. Oh.
Oh yeah, actually, yeah, because people were asking about examples of the kind of stuff we're talking about. So if you want, feel free to share your screen and look at that example I pasted. I think I've showed you that before.
Sure. I was going to ask if you wanted to pop that up or if you wanted me to.
I think it's more fun if you look through it because obviously I know my own code. I'll have a bad habit of zipping through it. If you're looking through it, you'll know what people might be interested in seeing.
All right, we got the tiny potion example. So, example of flag, stats, potions, and world actions and persistence. And this was the cool part that supports undo. So this is all using the command pattern, right? To do
pretty much, yeah.
Some executing and undoing is my guess. I mean, so just by reading that, that's what my assumption would be. That said, I have seen this code before, but I don't have it fresh in my head either. So I very loosely remember what it does. So you create players using your factory pattern, using actors.createPlayer, and create an NPC and create an army of 5. What's an army? I'm guessing an army is like a collection of NPCs, but
exactly. See, this is beautiful. Like I love. Literally, you're right guessing with all of the systems, even the design patterns. And by the way, just as a small note, the people out there who are talking about design patterns, this is what they're for. Because Jason can look through this code and he can intuit what design decisions I've made because of the fact that they conform to standards and practices for patterns. They're not about using them as tools to solve your problems. They're about linguistic tools that make it easier to kind of talk about and work with systems.
Yep. And this is definitely easy to read so far. So then you're adding 3 things to the world for some reason. The world must do something with them. It takes in things, or I guess these are basically players or characters or some sort. And then you get back a collection of actions and misname it to a singular action, just to confuse me.
Yeah, I probably should have called it actions. Yeah, I'll give you that one.
And then you call drink potion on it, and you give it the player, and pass in a healing potion, which I'm guessing comes from a factory method. Interesting. Okay. And then you got you have the NPC drink invincibility, the army drink vitality, and then the army drink death. And then you undo the last action, which would, I'm guessing that undoes their death potion.
Yep.
And then save the world. And then you reopen the last save. So I assume you restore the state back to, you've got 1 player, 1 NPC, and then 5 more probably NPCs that are in the army. Okay. So then let's see how the rest of this works. Now, obviously, it's not an actual game loop, right? This is just an example of using.
This is specifically applying, how to apply something complicated like stats and flags for characters, and be able to change them with something like potions or effects, and then be able to either undo them, redo them, or save those values.
You could also just do something like you could add in another update here that adds in actions to do things and then does some undoing, or some player trigger events or actions based on what they're clicking or whatever they're doing, right? Okay, so then in here, to create and modify stats with potions, you can use Potion Factory. Oh, okay, so this is how you make a potion. You add a method for the potion name, instantiate a new potion, give it a name and some text, and then I'm guessing this is setting a flag named invincibility.
It is, yep.
Like you're creating some string-based dictionary key flag and setting it to true and false, so you can do any generic thing without creating a new class, and you just make a method to toggle a Boolean parameter on and off. Okay.
And their collections too. I realize now in retrospect I should have done at least 1 collection, because you can have multiple flags set by any one potion or multiple things done. So that you can just do like invincibility true, comma, strength, and set to a number to it or something like that. So I didn't give an example of that, but you can set any number of flags or stats with any potion.
Okay, and then I'm guessing, now I could be wrong, but my guess is that when you set this this flag is somewhere in a flag system getting set on a collection of effects that are setting it to true or false, and then it's true if any one is true or something like that. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And then healing, you create a health, and you set the health to the max of X. I'm not sure what this is. So you're just setting it to
I admit,
the max
this
of the value?
This one is getting a bit confusing. But so basically, funny you talked about lambdas earlier. A potion basically lets you say if you want a potion to affect a value, you choose which stat you're affecting and then how you provide the value, and that functions a provider for where the value comes from, and you're passed the current potion, or the current actor, so you can choose to interact with the current actor to set the value. In this case, I'm saying when this potion is drank, set the stat called health to its max. It's sort of itself, right? So it's basically saying set them to whatever the full max of that stat is.
Got it. Interesting. I think people would be interested to see how that's defined and declared. To show that. Vitality. Okay, same kind of thing.
What the one difference is, the true flag at the end indicates that you don't affect the base stat, you affect the max stat. So by doing this, it increases the health's max value by 20%.
Ah, interesting. So instead of having a separate health max, you have a health. Okay, so it's essentially like a pool that has a max and a current value instead of a stat and another stat. That's good. You're gonna increase it by that amount, and then dead. So dead to true.
Dead's now, just good old true.
Oh, and it just sets a flag to true, and then other things could, I guess, read on that. So let's see. Where do we want to look? In the application?
Sure.
Let's see. Let's look at the game first. This is just the method that's kicking it off. We get our world. First I want to look at that army real quick. Create army. In the actor factory. So we got create army, creates a new army object, and then adds in NPCs, and then you've just got this new army class. Does the army do anything?
No, the only reason I demonstrated that is to say an entity drinks a potion, but an entity doesn't have to be a player or an NPC. It can be anything that is capable of drinking a potion. In this case, a collection of entities could theoretically drink a potion.
Got it. So then it just applies to all of the other entities inside there. That makes sense. Okay, so let's go. Actually, I want to look at that world real quick. Let's see. So in the world, we've got actions, just essentially some data, right? That's pretty much it. The world is just the data class holding a little bit of info. And then
it's basically the state system. So I could just have people drink potions and do things, but by having it happen via a world, it means the world state can be inspected and interacted with. So you can have things undone to the world relative to what individual commands were run.
That's cool. Let's look at the potions. So inside the potion, we've got the constructor here. We're giving it the name and the description. Apply effects, where you apply. Okay, so you just apply all of your effects to an actor, and then add. Okay, so here's where the effect part is happening. So you've got the stat name. This is that dictionary or keyed one, like the health or the invincible. Here you've got the function, so you're allowed to pass something in, and this is where I gotta go back to the other part, but where you're putting the e and then the lambda e.max.
Yeah,
so
it basically says
back the max of this.
Yeah, I'm saying I'm giving you the stat. Pick something relative to that stat to give me back the value to set it to. So either itself plus 10%, or its max value, or its whatever. If you want to, you can use that value, or you could obviously inspect other stats and do different things. But at base level, you're probably just going to take whatever the current stat is and modify it in some way. So I'm giving you the stat, and I'm asking you to return me back a number relative to that stat.
Right. So this stat right here is the input parameter, essentially. That's the e that we're seeing there. And the int is the dot max, the value that we're returning. So you get e, you have to declare, hey, this is e or whatever you wanted to call it. And then you return back the value after the lambda. So that's kind of how that was working. And then this was your bool for whether or not it changes the max. And then here you do a check. If it's doing the max, then do a stat max change. Otherwise, do a new stat value change stat value instead of change stat max. Interesting. It's very clean. It's very easy to understand and manage, I think.
And this is what I was saying, by the way. You'll notice here there's a bunch of add functions. So the add functions are just methods called add. And because of that, that's how you can do the curly bracket syntax. Just by the nature of having a method called add on a type which is an IEnumerable, it'll let me do those curly bracket syntax that makes it simpler on the construction side.
I had a Sour Patch Kid in my throat there, but yeah, that's the IEnumerable interface declaration there, the implementation down below. So if you got that and you add those add methods, then you can do the automatic constructor. That's really cool. I think overall this is very neat. And can you see this thing? Anybody's got access to it?
Yeah, it's public.
Share it with me?
It's on my GitHub/JSON story there.
Let me share this real quick. All right. Pop this into the YouTube chat.
So again, this isn't a game example. I don't want people to think this is like a perfect thing. Somebody asked me a question in one of the Discords, and they said, how would you do a stat system? And I was trying to explain it. And by the time I got to my second paragraph, I'm like, you know what, just give me a minute. And I just spent an hour and I made a quick demo to demonstrate it because it's easier than, I said this before, but programmers talk in code. So if you want to explain something to a programmer, you give them code. You don't try to write an essay around the code. So I just made an example that would explain it practically.
I tend to agree. If you can explain it and then show the code, it tends to be the best because people can actually see it, and then you get rid of the weird assumptions, and it makes it easier and I think a little bit more clear to explain. If you're writing it out, you don't miss things as much, and you don't like leave out a step that you might forget when you're saying it because you have to do it. This is definitely an interesting project, man. I really like it. I think I should use that.
I think I'm doing a few more of those. Yeah, I've got a few others in mind I want to do, like a UI one for dynamically building user interfaces and stuff. But generally, I just wanted to get across that another part of that project that we didn't kind of cover was that it currently saves things out in JSON, and that's what you saw. There's an example there of a JSON file, but I'm not writing JSON into the project. If you look at it, I'm using something called persistence, and persistence basically says, given a collection of a world state, do something, save it. And I made a separate implementation that conforms to that, which happens to save the JSON. So the reason I did that is if you came along and said, actually, we want you to save the entire game out as XML or as a binary file or send it to a web server, it would take me roughly 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes to write a script that would attach to that, and none of the code has to change. So probably one of the most valuable things to learn about building systems like that is to anticipate where changes are likely to happen and design to support that sort of change. Now, that doesn't mean over-engineering to write features that you don't need, but it's putting in boundary lines that say, this kind of thing is most likely to change. So what is the contract I need? Given X number of items, do a save. And if I define that contract, I can write the code on one side of that line. I'm not writing any other code I don't need, but I'm defining where the code would change in a hypothetical scenario where it does change.
Yeah, I think that's important because it's important to do it too without the over engineering, like you're saying. Because I think like a lot of the time people will run into that situation where they want their stuff to be flexible and ready, so they build it to work with everything, but they're never going to use the other things. They're just like, it's just a random one-off. Somebody had an idea once in a meeting once that, hey, maybe we'll switch to that sometime. They don't actually mean it. They don't intend to do it. And I've seen a lot of people code up systems that were intended to be able to do that already, like from the start. Like, hey, we have all this stuff set up, all this framework to be able to switch, and we're never going to do it. The easier thing, I think, is more what you said of just drawing those boundary lines so that your data or whatever the thing is that you need to work with that might change, the way that you're persisting your data might change, just keep that way that you're persisting your data in a clean, easy to address spot where you can swap it out and overload it and change it and make it a more versatile system if you need to. Don't have it be splattered out or spread throughout your code base, where your persistence code is in each class. Like every class handles its own persistence. And then if you want to go in and change it, you've got to go in and write a whole new thing of persistence for every single class, right? Keep it so that there's some I guess modularity there, so that you can swap it around without it being too difficult, but without going overboard and building something that you're not going to use yet too. So I think it's really important.
And another example of that too was why the fact. I think we've all done a bit of over engineering in our past. I think the other part too is, you might have noticed there's a very heavy use of things like factories there, and there's obviously an argument to be made that systems like that can be over engineering, that you may not need them. And while I would agree, and this was more of an academic example, it maybe is a little bit too many uses of patterns and things, but I was asked how would I approach this in a large project. Well, that's how I'd approach it in a large project. For that actual demo, I probably don't need as much architecture that's actually there, but that is a scalable architecture if the project had gotten bigger, which is kind of what I was really describing, was how a bigger system would work. The reason I bring that up is to say, the reason I use factories like that is because an example, and actually here's a good one. I'm currently working on an asset that will go on the asset store eventually. That's a weapon system. My friend who's an artist is making the guns. I'm just doing the code for it. So it's actually more about his shiny guns. I'm just making them animate and do stuff. So for that project, the way I'm dealing with weapons and things is, I don't want to write my code in Unity. I don't actually care if it's a rigid body or if it's a raycast or if it's a whatever. I care about, does the logic of, if you have enough ammo, can you shoot? If your gun needs reloading, it can. Various different things like that. I can write that code without worrying about the specific implementation. So by using factories, I can pass myself fake, simpler, or mocked versions of guns that don't use rigid bodies or don't use raycasts, but just do like set a Boolean true. It pretends a raycast happened, pretends it succeeded, and returns back a hypothetical true or false. I can write the rest of my code to test and verify that with my fake guns. And then when the time comes, I drop that working system into Unity. I replace the thing that does the firing portion with one that actually spawns a raycast, and everything works. And I can verify that it works, and I can work on it separately. So the use of factories is more of a testing tool there, and gives me the freedom to swap out different things. And I've done this before because it means, if you wanted a gun and you wanted to decide, hang on a second, I don't want this to fire raycast anymore, this is actually a projectile weapon, you shouldn't have to redesign your gun just because you've decided that the thing that happens at the end of the ammo check is a raycast or spawning an object. Realistically, it doesn't matter which one of those it is, because that's just the firing portion. So that's just another boundary line. It's the same thing we discussed. The boundary line is, when all things are said and done, when the ammo checks are done and all the other flags have been hit and you're ready to fire, do whatever that means, whether it's a raycast or spawning objects or faking it in some way.
I'm curious on factories. How often do you find yourself writing actual factory code that's generating and creating the objects in code versus just using some sort of a prefab or a scriptable object or something that you're instantiating or using for the data? Do you find that you use factories a lot? Is it a common thing that you're using, or are there like certain subsets or scenarios where you find you use them often?
I actually use factories for a lot of stuff, because the way I do it is, even if it is a prefab, I would, for example, again, great example being the gun again, or actually let's go with an enemy. So even enemy, and I want to do scripts where an enemy has health and can be damaged and whatever. Now, in the quote unquote real project, the enemy is actually a prefab where the health is, some health value on the object is moving around. So I could make a factory called create enemy, and as long as he has the interface enemy or whatever on him, I can have two factories, one that uses the prefabs from a scriptable object, picks it, instantiates it, and returns it, and I have a second factory which just returns a fake object called dummy enemy, which is just a number in it and doesn't have all of the plumbing and mess associated with it, and I would just swap them out when the time comes. So even though I do actually end up using scriptable objects and all of the prefab stuff, I don't surface that to the rest of the scripts. So I at the top level in Unity, there's not a lot of factory work, but sort of down the line, somewhere in the code, when I'm like doing checks to create stuff and compose a world or whatever, I might use factories there to simplify code. So again, or bullets, right? I said, if you want to have a gun that can fire different kinds of bullets, I might make a bullet factory that I hand to the gun, and the gun requests new bullets from the bullet factory. And that way I can decide later to move those bullets to being scriptable objects or to being simple objects or whatever, and I would just hand a different factory to the gun, and all of the gun work and logic stays the same. So I usually use it more, just like we discussed, as an abstraction layer. But I know what you're saying. Like, there's no real need oftentimes for a factory if you're just going to be doing it as prefabs you can drag in. But by doing just that layer, it means I can write the tests outside of Unity and outside of the which we discussed before is the big difference. I write most of my code outside of Unity where possible.
Well, it standardizes your use of those things, right? So if you're using it, if you use a factory method to spawn things, and that's just the way that you do things in your project, and you do that on everything that you can, it makes it pretty easy to understand like how you spawn things and how that process is set up and where you put the customization for spawning those things, or change it to be like a pooled system or something else. You do it in that factory. So I can see the benefit. I was just curious how often you actually did it. It sounds like you do it pretty much all the time, though, just kind of
in fact, actually, one that I do all of the time, which I think surprises a lot of people, is I use repositories for everything. Absolutely everything. And if you go through that example again at some stage, you'll see what I mean. I just don't call them repositories because I don't, again, I've said this before, I just don't think the word is valuable. I don't think it's useful to start leaning into boring naming conventions for the sake of it, like as long as the concepts hold true. So, for example, a potion is actually a repository of effects. That's all it is. It's a thing that has a collection of effects that you can query and get and interact with. And I use that whole collection initializer syntax and go through all of that. And the same thing then goes for actors. Like Army. Army is just a repository of NPCs. You can ask questions like, get all soldiers, get all archers, get all with health greater than whatever. So you can inspect that repository of things. It's just not specifically called a repository because I don't think the name is as valuable. The point of repository is to take a collection of items and make it look like an in-memory collection. So if this was some web-based app and those characters came from some web service, or I switched to addressables and I wanted to have addressables load in the characters rather than whatever else, I could still just call get actors from Army and it will figure it out itself. So yeah, I use those all the time, and I find that they're not just valuable from a code perspective, they're really valuable from a cleanliness perspective, because it makes a lot of sense for me to say actors dot where armor class is greater than 5. That's just a nice reasonable sentence where I don't deal with the array directly or the list directly or the dictionary directly. I have a class which is wrapped around the collection type, and I can inspect it specifically, and I can put any logic I want to in there. So if I wanted to basically say like if I wanted to give a spear to all soldiers in an army, I could just say army.give spear and hand it, or give weapon spear. And internally, because that's a feature I've said is an important part of my system, that all characters in an army can be given a new weapon at any time, I don't have to iterate an array separately and muddy the logic in later classes. If I'm specifically saying armies are things that can have this feature, it avoids something called feature envy, because I'm specifically saying armies have the behavior to assign weapons to all of their members. So yeah, I would say probably one of my secret weapons for my code specifically is how much I would use a variant of the repository pattern, because I do think it makes the code a lot cleaner. Or to put it another way, I make custom collection types all of the time. I don't talk to arrays or dictionaries. I will always wrap any large component set, whether it's cameras. In one project I did, I had a camera set, and a camera set was a collection of cameras. If I had weapons in an inventory, or weapons or an inventory, I would have a weapons object. I would literally have a class called weapons that would internally have a list of weapons, and every global weapon related stuff like turn off all weapons or equip a weapon or whatever would be questions I would ask the weapons class. So I would say wrap your collections wherever possible, would be, at least from my perspective.
Interesting. I'm going to pull up your army example real quick, just so everybody can see it again too.
And actually, just to answer your question, you were talking about flags, right? Well, if you actually look at the class, if you go down to the player, for example, you'll notice how the player deals with flags and stats, and it's exactly what I was describing.
Let's take a look at that right after this. I just want to show them when you're talking about making your own collections, essentially you're implementing this enumerable of a type interface on the class. So you make your own class. You implement this interface. As soon as you add that, it's going to tell you, hey, you got to go implement it. Then you implement it. You're going to get your get enumerator right here. You're going to add in your add method. And then essentially what you're doing right here with your get enumerator is returning back the current version of the actor, but then you've added other things on top of it. So here
exactly,
you've
right,
essentially got the ability to iterate. You can do for each actor in army, and it's going to loop over this list of actors. But then you can add things to them and do other stuff, right?
Yeah, and exactly, like the whole point of this is that there's behavior, like otherwise I would be storing a list or an array of actors somewhere, and I would, if I wanted them all to equip a weapon or all of them to drink a potion, I would have to iterate and do that for each one, when realistically, having a army, actually if you look at the top, he is an actor, he's not just a collection of actors, he himself is an actor as part of that collection. So an army can drink a potion. Now, obviously, that just means for each member drink the potion, but I don't have to write that code every time in different places. I can do it one time inside of the army. And if I decide there's a new feature where armies can change their formations or armies can upgrade their armor stats, I can do that in the army class. And everywhere in my entire project where I reference armies, I don't have to now go and do another for each thing in our member of armies, set your armor to whatever, right? If there is a feature that an army can do, it goes in the army, not in some other class or iterates a list.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you're keeping the logic of it inside its own class. And I think that's just the general idea of even creating this class and making sure that you're creating classes to hold other data and to hold other classes is important. Whether or not you get to Jason's level of being able to implement your own collections on top of it, which is a good thing to do. But even if you don't do that, just having classes that keep track of things instead of giant collections of things. So I think like you have old school stuff. There's been plenty of games where like the entire game is in a single file and there's just a list of all of the data objects there, and then they're all dealt with in there. And then you get to the point where it's like entities are all in one file. There's one class that's managing every single entity and every collection of entities, and dictionary and way that entities are handled is all in that one file. And then the point is really breaking it down into smaller and smaller parts, like these subgroups and these usable collections of data and like things in your game that you're going to use together and act on or act upon together.
And if you want a perfect example of this, what is a player but a collection of flags and stats, right? That's what we've established a player is. Various flags, various stats. So how am I doing that? How did I decide to make that work? Well, here's a player.
Yep.
And you'll see here I'm calling something. Yeah, exactly. And you're seeing that I'm calling two things. I'm calling stats and flags. And it's like, well, what are stats and flags? You might instinctively think maybe that's a list of type stat. Well, as for what I've just said, it's not. It's a class called stats because that's what stats are. They are stats.
Yep, the same kind of thing, except now you've got your custom indexer, so you can find it by name.
And if you look right at the bottom, there's a function there called fill, because one feature I've said that stats can have is maybe I want to fill all my stats. A character's respawned or I've made a new instance. I can add a piece of behavior that is stats refill yourselves, and I don't have to go in and manually iterate through every stat to fill it, because conceptually what I'm saying is stats should have a feature to fill themselves. And I might add a stat deplete or a stat, add buff, an upgrade or something, and it would add 10% buff to all the stats or whatever. I can do this because I've isolated the concept of stats as their own entity and not just an arbitrary list of different things.
Which is definitely the right way to do it. And let's look at this flags too. Flags are essentially the same. Yeah. Hold on, I want to go up one level and let's look at the actor real quick too.
And for an interesting hot take on this too, with the stats and flags, right now the stats, the flags specifically are pretty inefficient. I'm using a list to handle my flags. I don't need to use a list to handle my flags. I should be using a dictionary. A dictionary is a better approach for that. But here's the thing. If I changed the code under that, if I changed flags to a dictionary right now, you wouldn't know any difference because you're talking to flags, you're not talking to a list or to a dictionary. So by drawing that boundary line, I can decide later to optimize the bad mistakes I made as an efficiency thing early without affecting the rest of the code. So as I would grow this project, I would probably change the flags to being a dictionary. But that wouldn't ever be something you would see because it's part of the inside of my problem of making the code better, not affecting the contract that I'm exposing out to the rest of the system.
Right, that's a thing you could fix later if and when it actually became a problem. If your game ended up only having 10 flags, you go, hey, we don't need to even waste the time. But if you start to see that it's getting big, you could easily optimize it without changing anything. I think it's perfect. You've got here's your actor where you've got your stats and your flags. Yes. Looks like you've got them set read only, so they just get set on the construction time and then wrapped so they're available to add and modify to those collections. And then, okay, then we get into sets. That's pretty simple. You pass in a flag. Oh, okay. So flags take a bool and stats take an int. That's how you determine the difference right now. Instead of having a set flag or a set stat, you just do set and then depending on the type. That's the only part I found I didn't like so far, Jason.
Yeah, because you want to specifically call it set flag and set stat, wouldn't you? Yeah,
it's only because it's very implicit, like to know which one you're doing. Type, and you'd have to know the context. But yeah, I think overall this is really cool. I want to look at the way that you're saving the data too.
So and actually, that's a good example too to talk about the saving. I just want to say one thing. There's one question asked: are all of the strings error prone? I would say. Technically, yes. There's something called strongly typed versus stringly typed. And stringly typed means that you're using plain text strings to calculate stuff. And you can get into a weird territory where if you have the uppercase or lowercase wrong, things can go badly. That can be confusing. So on balance, I agree with you. But if you're building a stat system in a game, as I'm sure Jason will attest to, designers will add stats on a whim. There'll be like millions of stats and flags and things, and you don't want to be building an array. You have to recompile the code base just because someone decided to add like vitality as a new concept to your game. So that you normally make the compromise that you make stats and things strings, but what you do is you simply save yourself the hassle by moving the problem up a level, and you build custom tools that will always type the right names in for you. So like you shouldn't have to be writing the string ever, because by the time we get to the top level, there will be some tool that lets you pick from a list and it will do it, or you can add to a list and you don't have to manually type it. So yes, stringly typed can be a problem, but if you know you're building to a tooling system, it can be fine if the compromise is worth it.
Yeah, that's especially true for flags. So stats, depending on the game, you may or may not have designers adding them. A lot of the time, you'll have them adding them early on, and then that'll kind of get solidified. Flags, though, pretty much always you're going to have designers just creating new ones. And yeah, either using strings are good. The other one issue that you missed too is that a lot of the times, not everybody's a good speller. And people will spell things wrong, and one person knows how to spell a thing, the other person knows to spell it wrong, and a third person spells it completely wrong in a different way, or spells it British, or English, if you want to call it English. I'm just kidding. But there is, like you said, tooling can help. Another thing that I like to use is just scriptable objects too. If it's not going to be too many for something like stats. Because then there's just a reference to it, and then you're dragging it in without creating too much extra tooling. But having some tooling and some error notification can help. It does, however, become a problem, though. You can run into issues where a designer will sit there and be screwed the whole day, not realizing that they put a lowercase h in health, and that's why it's not working. So one of the things that I generally try to do with any of the string type stuff is
case
to make it totally case insensitive.
Yeah. So actually, I don't know if I did that in this one. I may have done that. That if there's a search feature on the flags, for example, I think there's a find method, and I might be using string comparison ordinal ignore case on that. If I am, that's usually how I handle it. I normally make it case insensitive as well.
Yeah, when it gets to the point where you're actually dealing with designers, you'll start to run into the edge cases. And one of the things that you'll want to make it case insensitive. You'll want to start trimming the spaces when you realize that, they added an extra space at the end, and that's why it didn't work. And I had to go in and debug it and spend 4 hours trying to figure out what was wrong because there was a space there. You'll start to catch those.
And I get just to be really clear on the point is, so we're saying we agree that stringly typed is bad, but I would say the reason why it's bad, it's like singletons, right? They're not bad because they're singletons, they're bad because of how they can be misused. And in the same case with strings, they're only bad if your design of your system requires people who use it to magically guess and get correct strings right. And there are ways to mitigate that. And some of the options people said as well is if I was giving this to someone else temporarily, I would probably write a class which has public read-only strings or something, and it would be like stats dot, and I would manually type them out, or for the first couple of sets of them. And once we get past 20 and it starts to become impractical to be typing them out manually, then I would do it the other way. But I would say I wouldn't. That's not a problem that's worth solving until it's a problem. And right now, in this sort of system size, it probably isn't. And if you're looking for problems that are bigger, recompiling an entire code base to add one stat is a considerably bigger problem, rather than, oh no, I might have made a spelling mistake. Now, again, that is a thing that is a problem, but if you're weighing it on balance, it's probably less of a problem.
Yeah, or the bigger problem of, oh no, I need a programmer to make any change.
Yeah, just to make any changes at all.
I can't make a stat, so we just won't do any new stats because only a programmer can do that, and I can't bother them.
Yeah.
And then it has to be in the build, and then I can't even try it and play with it until tomorrow. So if I want to try an experiment by creating a new stat, like it's a multiple day turnaround. And it doesn't start off that way, but it gets to that way quickly when you start getting 100%. Super opinionated on these things.
You never want to be in the way of your designers. You never want to be actively the reason they can't get their work done.
No, it's not fun because then you can't get your work done because you're spending your whole time trying to make it so they can do their stuff. So you want to make it as easy as possible, I think.
To Thought Drifter there, that's not the way you do string comparisons, by the way. You don't trim it and go to lowercase. You're better off using dot equals to the second string, and one of the parameters of the equal methods when comparing two strings is called string comparison. And one of the string comparison types is ordinal ignore case. So string dot equals other string, comma, string comparison, ordinal ignore case. That will do what you're doing there, but it'll do it in a more reliable way.
Wait, does that handle the trim?
It doesn't handle the trim. You have to trim it yourself. That is true.
I was wondering. I was like, if that handles the trim, I've been overkilling it for a while. But I say handles the case enough.
Yeah, annoyingly, I wish it did. I wish there was an option called string comparison.trim ordinal ignore case, but no, there isn't, unfortunately.
that would be great. Maybe we just add it in. You can write to Microsoft, see if you can get it submitted. I'll email my buddy that works there, see if he can. I'm just kidding. I'm sure he can't, but that's what we need. New string comparison, the number one request for C#, right? Yeah, I like scriptable objects. There's a little mention in there too. I really like using scriptable objects for those things because they're easy to find and address and add notes to as well. If you do it in a scriptable object instead of a string, you can allow designers to actually write in notes about what that stat does or what that flags for and add in extra information. Sometimes it doesn't always apply. Yeah. It's definitely not always needed, but if you get to some points at least, it can come in handy.
Yeah, I've definitely done that in the past. I often do that for we talked about factories before. I will often do factories for visual components. So, for example, the difference between models and view models, I'll often have like a collection of items, but I'll pass the collection of items through a factory that's a scriptable object factory, bind them one-to-one to the factory objects so that the designers can apply sprites for images or sound effects for things. And then the objects get basically moved from a data structure to a view model, and it gets all of those different things. So you can customize it in the editor via scriptable objects, but I still get to do all of my clean code outside of it.
That's kind of neat. I have to check out an example.
I have an example I can't really show here because it's more of a client project, but I'll show you a little thing I have, which is I built a menu system for a mobile phone. That has it dynamically builds basically the Android menu system from a configuration file.
Oh, neat. Check that out. Yeah, you got to show me some stuff offline, I guess, and then I think that'd be a neat one to just make a demo on and show people. Kind of cool.
Yeah. I guess I'm trying to think of anything else interesting in that project. And again, I really can't stress enough. This wasn't meant to be some case study. It was like an hour of doing a thing to demonstrate an idea. But it is funny because, to be fair, it's one of the few times I wrote code and didn't analyze what I was trying to teach. Because normally I'm very cautious to try not to put too many ideas in one example because it makes it harder to explain. So that example is one of the few that I just wrote code the way I would write code and then stopped afterwards and said, okay, how did I write this? I didn't plan it as a lesson. And so there is actually a lot of decisions in there that I don't even realize I make until I stopped and read it myself, you know?
Oh yeah. It's always interesting trying to turn the process into something that's teachable. Cause like you've got to remember to keep all of the requirements and the prereqs and stuff and the kind of required knowledge to understand what's going on and to explain why you're making a decision when you're trying to do it. Where when you just make a project, like you can make the decision knowing that like you're going to do this other thing in 3 hours, or I'm going to do this other thing on Tuesday, so I'm doing it this way for that, and explaining that in a video or just to somebody else, even to somebody on your team, sometimes can be extremely hard. Like working with somebody and going like, I'm coding it this way for a reason. Like there's really a good reason. I show you, and I can show them, but it's just going to take a lot more time and energy to do that than to do it.
Yeah.
So
It's funny you say that. One of the people in the chat is somebody I work with sometimes, and they have a particular habit of when I'm demonstrating some code, going, "Oh, why are you doing it that way? Or why'd you write it that way?" I said, "Well, if you wait about 30 seconds until I get to the end of this thought, you will see why I'm doing it that way."
I probably do that to people all the time too, though. I really struggle. Like I have a hard time shutting up and not asking questions.
To be fair,
try really hard to not ask questions. I'm like, wait, what? Whoa, I want to know more.
Actually, someone gave an interesting point there. Someone said, "Why don't you make your own string library?" I have a string library. Actually, it's a side thing. I have a bunch of GitHub packages I'm putting up at the moment that I'm working on. They're not ready for release or anything, but I mean, they're up there on the GitHub as well. There's a bunch of the extensions one is already working. That's my validation extensions. So I add to every one of my projects an ability to validate input strings and the fields in my inspector. And so
like serialized fields, correct?
Yeah, serialized field validation. And so if you want, that's up there too. Just feel free to pull down that GitHub thing into your project, and you can have a look at the way I validate my input field.
Nice, yeah. So go grab that. So there are a bunch more questions that are popping up. Do you want to? Should we just hop into a couple more? Do you have a preference on one? I know I popped up the last two, so maybe I'll let you pick one.
One good one here is how do you decide to break up code into different projects? I'm curious for your opinion on that one first.
Well, let me see. Into different projects? I would say that in general, I don't anymore. So I used to, here's the question. I used to do that all the time. When I was doing a lot of enterprise development, separate projects was just kind of the default. You create a new solution, you've got your new projects, and whatever. It was already somewhat broken up, or I had a structure for how I was going to segment out and break the code up. And it was partially just because different people would be working on different parts of the code. So I would have different sections that people would be working on. Part of it was also just convention, just following like, here are all the examples. Here are the ways that I've learned to do it. Here are the ways that I've broken up the projects in the past. So I'm just going to follow that that same exact pattern. What I found a lot of the time with the enterprise stuff was that outside of testing and outside of writing unit tests, it almost never made much of a difference because things just didn't get reused very often. There were some things that got reused, some very small parts of things that got reused across projects, but in general, there's just not that many projects at the company that are working on similar things, reusing a lot of the same stuff, but and being different enough that they shouldn't be the same project, essentially. So it would either be like, either this is a feature of this application, or it's something that's probably not used by any other application, or it's an API. And it's like some data store, some remote API that should then be split off to because multiple things are going to access this. The likelihood and their actual instances of reusing code between projects was immensely low. Definitely not worth the energy put into making it possible, or the effort. Now, that said, there was not a lot of energy and effort in splitting projects in C# in enterprise stuff. In Unity, there's quite a bit more. There's a lot more separation that goes on. If you want to actually build your DLLs outside of Unity, pop them into there. It's an extra step. There's extra work there. You can use the assembly definitions to kind of get part way there and get a lot of what you might want from it. But I haven't really run into any. I would be honest, I can't think of a single scenario where I've run into where it was a time saver and super helpful to split it out, where it actually made a big difference. There are lots of times when I thought like, hey, this is going to be useful, but we didn't do it. That There's one scenario though where building things for other developers to use to pop into their game. But even then, that's still not really a separate project. It's just a different thing that is getting integrated in. It's more like building an external third-party library than a separate project. So yeah, I guess I don't do it anymore. What about you, Jason? I know you still break things up a bit, or
I do, but I want to come back to that in a second, because the kind of what you were saying, I 100% agree with. And the way I would phrase it, if you want a shorthand for when you should break something up into other projects per se, the name for it's called the rule of 3, which is, if you've used something in a project and you found it really valuable, don't split it out into another project. Do another project. If you find yourself wanting that code from the other project, copy it in. Use it again. And you might change it or add features or whatever. Then still don't make a separate project out of it. If you do a third project and you found the same piece of code is pretty much useful with a few tweaks, you now know this thing is something you probably want to take out, put it in somewhere else, and you've now also got 3 separate examples of how it changed or modified over the course of multiple projects, and it'll be much easier for you to find the parts that are reusable because you've got multiple examples of how the requirements shifted in different projects. That's a quick shorthand of, if you want to know when, wait till you've used it 3 times organically, and then that's a good example. But I think to augment the question a bit and answer it sort of in a more interesting answer, if you think more about modules or parts of the code, that's a more interesting question. And to Jason's point there, what kind of he was alluding to is, I do that a lot. I will frequently split up pieces of my application. I do put them into separate class libraries, and so technically you could say different projects, but I think that defeats the point of the question. It's not that they're different projects, it's that I'm drawing boundary lines across those pieces. And I would say that's probably the same thing, is that from a system design perspective, how do you know when something's a separate system? I think that's a more interesting question. So I'll throw that one back to you. When do you know something deserves to be moved, like separated out into its own thing, separate from the other systems?
Ooh, that's a good one. So this is more like we're staying in the same project. We're like in a single game, and we've got different systems in there. How do we separate those out so that they're not, essentially, to try to keep our project clean and keep it from becoming a mess?
For an example from your own stuff, you've got a quest system which deals with an inventory, which deals with some dialogue stuff, which deals with doors and things. Where do you know where to draw the lines of which thing represents what system how, you know?
Right. For me, it's very much on eliminating as many of the dependencies as possible. So when I break things into different parts of projects, especially, so when I force break them using things like script assembly definitions, the general way that I'll do it is to segment and separate out the system so that they can't be misused. What usually happens for me is that I'll start coding it, I'll start writing up my system, and I'll start writing up the different parts. But maybe I'm writing up my inventory system and I'm building up the inventory UI part of it, right? And the second that I start to see that I'm doing something bad in my inventory UI, like I'm dealing with logic for how my inventory is stored or something like that, anything other than passing something into my inventory, I'll go, okay, this is a potential risk, and I need to split this out and make it so that it's just not possible for me to do that anymore. And then I'll generally split it out into something like a separate assembly definition where I can limit the way that the dependencies are going to a single direction, so that I don't end up putting the logic and passing, basically inverting my logic of my entire project. Now, when it comes to breaking apart actual pieces outside of that, so because that's like at the more extreme level, where I'll usually do that kind of at a UI level or an input level, or kind of maybe some other base system level, but I'll very rarely break up my actual systems into separate projects where they can't do that. Instead, I'll do a more logical separation where they won't ever have dependencies on each other, but there's nothing in my solution or project that's technically preventing them. It's just the way that I'll design my things so that my systems will ideally just not rely on each other at all, so that they can work independently. I mean, kind of the goal is like, if I've got an inventory system in my game and I've got a quest system in my game, if I pull out that quest system and my inventory system just breaks and I can't compile anymore, I feel like I have screwed up. I've made a big mistake, and I've made it so that my systems are not easy to work with. They're not easy for me to change. They're not easy for me to make decisions and make easy modifications to my game. So I want to make sure that whatever system it is, I can disable that, turn it off, delete it completely. My game will still compile, and everything is still going to work. I might not get everything that I want, like the quest might not actually give me an item because there's no inventory, but it shouldn't blow up and just not work at all because the inventory system's disabled. So I'll separate them out. I guess somewhat logical. It's very hard to explain it like without showing code, though. I feel like I struggle without
because even if you describe the boundaries, there's still the question of like, do you use some sort of strategy or service, or do you use events or whatever? And people are still going to be curious as to that. But I understand the premise of what you're saying. It's basically down to, can you independently deploy each portion? That's one of the ways people phrase that. They said, could I take one chunk of my application and independently deploy it? And for example of this, there was a sample project that I really liked on GitHub at one stage where someone had made a version of Mario in Unity, like the full character controller, Mario 64, backflips and all the cool stuff. And I'm like, this is really fun. I want to just drop Mario in my own empty scene and test some level design stuff. And then I dragged Mario in, and it said, cannot instantiate, requires the ground manager. So I drag in the ground manager. Cannot use ground manager, requires enemy manager. So the dragging the enemy manager. And then by the time I had dragged in every dependency required to get Mario to stand perfectly still and not break the project, I just rebuilt the whole project in the scene again, because every single system was dependent on the next thing. And that is the exact opposite of independent deployability. I can't just check one system. I need every single piece of the application in my project just to see if I can have a perfectly standing still character. And so that's a good metric for why you do it. The terminology that I use is something that I think was Bob Martin that said this, and it really stuck with me, was things should have only one reason to change. That's part of the whole single responsibility stuff. But what's more interesting to me is how that plays out. So people think about the single responsibility principle and they think only in terms of classes. This one file should have only one reason to change. But what's more interesting is to think about why things change at all. So when he goes into his longer form description of that, he has his own website where he talks about design patterns. And he actually spends 2 hours just talking about these single individual principles. And he highlighted one really interesting thing, which was, it's why would something change? Well, more importantly, who's going to ask for the change? So at an enterprise or corporate level, there is a designer who might want to redesign the UI. There is a systems admin who might want to choose a different backend architecture. There is some business plan that might want to deploy to multiple platforms. There is some gameplay designer who might want to change the rules for how inventories work. These are all different people who have different things that might want to change. And so the kind of magic trick is to design your code such that each person's requests are isolated. So it's not about what will change, it's about who will request a change and why. So that kind of gives you a hint about where to draw the lines. So I will draw a line around stuff that affects how the UI draws, because that's one reason to change. People might want the UI to change, and that shouldn't affect the business rules as to what's happening, or the game rules as to how it works, or where the data is saved, or how that works. So if can I slice a line there and make the entire UI look completely different without breaking anything else? So that's one slice. The next thing is, what if someone tells me there should be more or less weapons per stack in an inventory? Or what if there's some rule that you're not allowed to store live animals in the inventory, some other rule related to the game? I should be able to add that rule, and I shouldn't have to redesign the UI, and I shouldn't have to redesign the database. That's just a thing that's a rule that affects how both sides work. And same down the chain. I may decide to change the code from being saved in JSON files to being saved in a database or being saved in XML. That's a decision that might be made for a very different reason, and it shouldn't affect the other things. So where I draw the lines boils down to, if someone asked for this to change, could I change that without having a ripple effect down the rest of the system? So single responsibility or single reason to change isn't just about individual scripts, it's about systems. Why would this system or this block need to change?
All right. I think it's important for everybody to note too that you're not always going to know exactly where those lines are the first time you're coding it, right? Sometimes it's when
they evolved.
change comes in that you see like, okay, this is where the changes are actually going to happen. And then the best thing to do is really take advantage of that time to start making the boundary. If you don't have a boundary there yet, and you're seeing that like, hey, I have to go change these 3 things or these 5 spots to make this change, like think about maybe this is where a boundary should go, or maybe somewhere in here is where this boundary should be added. And don't necessarily try to pre-guess that too. Sometimes you can pre-guess it because you know what it is. You've done it before, you've seen it, good to go. Like, you know exactly where the boundary should be. But if you're just wildly guessing, a lot of the time you're going to just guess wrong. So sometimes you just wait until the scenario comes where you've got to make that first one, and then you say, okay, this is a good boundary line. And then the next time come through, just reevaluate. Hey, was that actually the right line? Does this need to move? Is this good? If not, then we're good to go and keep expanding from there. Because everybody that's talking about has done it many, many times before.
Even then, I say the same thing. I still fight my instinct to do that for exactly the reasons you said. So what I do is I write the code simply as it can be first. And oftentimes that means I've tied like 15 different systems together, and it's a mess. But then what I do is I give myself a requirement. I pretend I'm the business, and I ask myself, okay, can you change the UI so it looks like this? And I'm like, oh shit, I can't. No, it's difficult. And so I would then make it do the second thing, and then I would make sure that I can switch a line of code and put back the old way or the new way. And the act of doing that means, cool, I've supported a new feature, but I've maintained the integrity of the code. So obviously it's a luxury you can do in your own projects. You may not have the luxury to go and do hypotheticals when working for somebody else, but I would say the principle is the same, is draw a line around some new thing changes. Can the code support that change? And once you can start supporting changes, that's when you know you've got a good boundary line.
Yeah, and if you're curious where the boundary lines are, if you're like having a hard time figuring that out, one of the things I like to do is just grab either a pen and paper, or lately I use Milanote for it, but anything that you can just draw some boxes and some arrows. What you can do is just look at the actual dependencies in your code, see how things are tied together, what thing depends on what, and start looking for those loops. When things are looping around and you're getting the circular dependencies, start looking for those and start to see where you can cut those out. They tend to be very obvious or an easy way to find some points. If you're just like, I don't know where to start, look for those circular dependencies and see if there's a way that you can start cutting those out, because that's usually right around where the boundary needs to be, is where you're setting up those dependencies. There was a question on inventory and quest stuff too, which I think kind of lines in. So this says, say for your quest and inventory system, how do you keep that completely independent when a piece of inventory might be rewarded on quest completion? And there are ways to do it, but I think that what you were talking about kind of alludes to the solution, is that you probably really wouldn't. You would probably just allow your quest system to give items as a reward, and then know that inventory is such an essential part of your game that you're not, if you've decided that you're removing inventory from your game completely, like items are no longer a piece of your game. That's not a small decision. That's
a redesign. Yeah, that's like other concerns at that stage.
So deleting the 3 or 4 lines in the quest system that are integrating into the inventory to add an item to it, or that are checking the inventory to see if you have an item, those are a very, very minor piece of the integration. So I don't know that I would even worry too much about keeping those things too independent. I just wouldn't have the quest system be knowledgeable about everything in the inventory system. They should know how items work, what the different types of items are, or anything else like that. Maybe just the ability to add an item and check to see that you have an item, or you have some number of an item, and that would be kind of the boundary and the limitation, and just not let it get too deep.
I might even say that, so 100% is that the idea that if you're saying that it's intrinsically part of that system that rewards can be given, then you don't want to decouple the concept of rewards. But what you might do is you might realize that they're technically different things. You have an inventory is a collection of stuff that can add or receive items or whatever. And then you might have something called a reward system, or you might have some sort of items that are held. And then part of a quest could be that something can be given or taken, and you can hand it something that deals with the giving and taking. And an implementation of that giving and taking thing might be one that does it via the inventory. So the contract or the relationship between the quest system and the inventory doesn't mean it needs to know everything about your inventory. It needs to know if the inventory can qualify to answer questions. Do you have this item? Can I have this item? Can you take this item? If you can answer those questions, you can pretty much do everything you need to with your quest system. And then whatever happens to be an inventory happens to be an inventory. It doesn't matter as long as it can answer the appropriate questions asked of it by a quest system.
Yeah, and you could even, if you really wanted to separate, you could just be at the point where you have maybe a scriptable object that's a reward that you can then override with an item reward that you can drop in, and you could do all of that. I just don't know. I think that as you try to work on separating them too much, you also want to make sure that you're not overcomplicating it. You don't want to add in extra steps for your game designers so that they have to do a bunch of extra work. And you don't want to make it harder for your code to follow on something that's not going to change. I mean, the goal of keeping your code easy to change is like keep the things that are actually going to change very easy to change. And this thing that would be very minor to change, I wouldn't overcomplicate it to make it easier to change in the future. So that because if you decide that you're not going to have an inventory system, you're doing a whole lot more than that, right? It'd be more if you're deciding that you want to not have some specific subtype of quest, right? Like we don't want to have escort quests or whatever, some little sub thing.
Yeah, so something that's very important to remember, and this is one of those, like, I had to learn this the hard way because I always felt the opposite. I always felt the cleanest code is the one that has the like sharpest lines with divisions and nobody knows anything about each other. And you end up having to jump through a lot of hoops to make your code that decoupled to the point that your code becomes a mess to work with. And I have a general rule above all other rules with my code, which is if I don't like using my code, I have to stop and reevaluate why I've made it so complicated that I don't even enjoy using it. And oftentimes once you get to the like, I just want to give this item reward from this quest and I have to do like instantiating 6 objects and pass them through loops of things, I'll hate that. And so I would at best try to hide it through some simple interface or an extension method. But realistically, I would try not to go that far in the first place. So a good rule of thumb is to remember that an interface is by design a way of letting you interface between different things. And so if you've got a system, I always ask myself a kind of comedically over the top example. Like if I'm doing a thing that like is a screen readout that displays numbers like a calculator, and I start building an interface for that, I have to stop and ask myself, am I planning of connecting this to like the stock exchange? Is that something I'm doing right now? No. So why would I need an interface for this? Like what is it connecting to that would require this level of abstraction? And if the answer is nothing, then don't do it. There's no need for it. When the time comes, abstractions will happen because you'll hit a wall. You will want it to do X. It can't do X because it can only do Y. Then, in order to make it do X or Y, now you need an interface. So don't preempt those things. You wait until you hit a wall and go, I wish my code could do this. It can't. I need to make it now be able to do both of those things. Then you've actually got a direct problem which requires an interface to solve.
Yeah. It's just not, I think that's kind of been like the whole theme of the day is just keeping it as simple as possible. And like I said, the biggest goal is keeping the code readable and understandable, at least for me now. It used to be making it advanced, complicated, and flashy so I could show it to people. And then I would show it to people and they would get lost and confused. And then I would get lost and confused trying to explain it. And I go, okay, this is maybe not the best idea. And then I'd see it again. And what I realized was the code that I liked to read was the stuff that was simple, that was human readable, that I could easily just grasp what was going on by stepping through the code, by looking at it without having to jump around and keep, 4 or 5 different places in my head. If I have to keep 5 different classes and methods in the stack in my head of exactly what's going on, I'm gonna eventually lose it and I'm gonna make a mistake. So having it all right there, nice and easy, readable, so much more important than anything else, I think.
And this gets to naming convention stuff too. Like a trick, well, I guess a problem I've noticed with a lot of people that I consult with is that a lot of programmers think in code, which is actually a detriment because what happens is they start answering questions by talking about, oh, well, this is a blank handler and this is a thing processor and this is a manager for this stuff. And all of a sudden the code starts reading like some weird abstraction of complicated concepts. That example I showed you, the names of the things were army, NPC, potion, and stat. Like there wasn't was it technically a stat factory and a thing army and whatever? Like, I could have put in managers and entities and other buzzwords and other manager stuff, but would it have actually made it easier to read or harder? So I asked myself the conversation I wanted to have with the person reading my code, which is, and I didn't call it like army factory. If you noticed, the actual code was army.create, or it wasn't army, that wasn't army factory.create. It wasn't whatever the thing is, or potions or potion.create or whatever. Like I wanted it to read as close to what the statement of intent I had in my brain was. So for all of this stuff, you should be able to read it and explain it in as close to English as you can.
Yeah, it makes sense because you want to read it again. Like you're going to read it later and you need to understand what it's doing. And when you add in extra words, it just takes up extra brain power. So it's one of the things I always try to fight against too. When I find myself adding in extra words that don't need to be there, just trying to delete them and shorten things out. And add in enough words that it makes sense and use full words, but don't add in extra stuff. One thing I hate is like abbreviating words or like half abbreviating words and then doing it differently everywhere. I see that so often. And like, I'm not sure why this is short. Is it short for a reason? Does it mean something? Does this mean the word that I think that it means? Is it supposed to mean something else? Because there have been plenty of times where somebody abbreviated something and they meant something completely different than what I thought they meant, just because it also happened to be short for the same thing, you know?
Or the other one is where some word is used so often that it has no meaning. If you call every single script the UI manager and the system manager and the entity manager and the character manager and the persistence manager, it's like, cool. So everything's a manager. So what does the word manager mean? It doesn't mean anything if literally everything is a manager, you know?
Yeah, it's kind of what happens, right? Got to keep it clean, keep things named well, and rename things. Be willing to just hit Control RR or F2 and rename things when they're badly named. It's easy. It's one of the habits I picked up from my buddy Matt. He told me that he generally like renames everything like 4 or 5 times. Yeah, that's not a bad idea. I was like, that's okay. I guess you're right. Like I do name things bad the first 3 times, and getting the name right is more important than being right the first time.
And in fact, actually, I said I've used this as a tip in one of the previous episodes, but I honestly, like, all of the rules that we're saying and how you should name things correctly can start to be a bit daunting. You can start asking yourself, what is the perfect name for this script? And it can get pretty scary. You're like, I don't know what to call this. And I've stopped myself mid-typing code to sort of sit and like scratch my head for 15 minutes about a name. And it's so stupid, just wasting time, and you're not being productive. So, like, the reason why is that the script's not done yet. Like, you don't know what it is, right? Like, if you haven't made it, if you're a kid playing with Lego blocks, you don't name what you're making until you're done. You look at what it turned out to be and you're like, oh, it's a train. That's what I made. So you work in reverse. You end up with making the code first. And once it's taken shape, you can start seeing where the lines are. So a habit I have is I will pick stupid names. Like, I will legitimately call something thing doer or stuff maker or creation factory thing. Whatever stupid name that I know, I make it so dumb that I look at it and I know it's not a real name. Like, I know there's no risk of me ever actually wanting that to be something names. And then later on, I'll just keep writing the code. And at some point, the code will be robust enough. It'll have a bunch of systems. It'll be doing loads of stuff. And then I'll stop and go, what the hell is this thing? And then I'll read the code that I wrote and I'll say, oh, it's creating the armies. So I will call it army creator or armies or whatever, because it now has a job, because it has now found its place in the system. So if you ever find yourself freezing because you can't find the perfect name for something, name it the dumbest thing you can think of and just get back to work.
That was something I used to get caught up on too. When I first decided that having good names was important, I found myself sitting there waiting, trying to think of a good name forever. And then I think I actually told my friend Matt that. I was like, yeah, it's like, it's important, but like I always have a hard time. He's like, yeah, just come up with something and rename it. Like, you have tools. Stop being stupid. Like, your tools will do that for you. You just hit the button and it's fixed. So you just come up with something, and then the name kind of, I think, becomes apparent as you know what it does, like you said, because when you start, it's just an empty class that has a start and an update or nothing at all. It's nothing special. So well, we're almost out of time. Did you want to jump into a couple tips, or were there any questions that you wanted to hit before we wrap things up?
I'll be honest that this
back on and start squishing my head again soon.
Well, the weather has kind of let's just say I've not been super productive today, so my normal strategy of having tips ready is not quite there. I might have some, let me just check, but I haven't prepared any like I normally do, so this may be a bit weak on the tip side because I've just
I'll flash through a couple quick questions real quick while you do. So, would you instantiate all the objects in the game through a pool or just some, like bullets? Just some. And the just some is the ones that are going to instantiate and deinstantiate often, or that there are going to be a lot of, and I need to worry about the memory management. If they're not something that I need to worry about, then I won't worry about putting them into a pooling system unless I've got something set up that's already dealing with it and makes it extremely simple. But in general, use pooling when it's needed, which is for things like spawning enemies, spawning bullets, spawning things that appear or disappear and get reused often, or that come in at a very high rate, and not for other things just because it's just extra overkill. I got to worry about resetting those objects and all the other things that come along with it. So yeah, only some things. Let's see, what else do we got here? How do you make a form with all characters, items, and data and character info? So if you mean like an editor form, you can actually do some editor tools that will go through and dig up all of that. So it'll go through your project, find all of the items in there, and show all of those. If you want one that's very specific to like your gameplay, though, where you're showing like your character data and your items and all that, it's quite a bit more complicated. The data and stats, like character info stuff, is pretty simple. You just set up some labels, and you'd need to do a little bit of what we call data binding, where you'd bind up those labels to read the value from the character's stats. Maybe you'd have like a stats like Jason has, and then you just have those labels read a stat and then set their text value to that stat. That's the simplest thing. For items, it's quite a bit more complicated. I don't know that we could get into it, but you'd have to show icons that represent them and then figure out how you want to do interaction and all that other stuff with them. Let's see. Were there any other quick ones? Oh, how to use a database in Unity for games to store characters and items and data. So if you want to use an actual database, like something like
SQLite's probably an easy one. Yeah.
What's that?
SQLite would be an easy one to kind of jump into, right? Because that doesn't require you to have
a very simple one would be SQLite. You could pull that in and you could store stuff locally to your character, or locally to your system. So you could actually write in and do like update, insert, and delete statements. Or I believe you can even use like a lightweight ORM, object relational mapper, that allows you to store data in kind of like Entity Framework. I don't know that EF would work, but I know there's some other options where you could store data into that local database and then read it back out using standard SQL queries. But the normal thing that's done is that this stuff is saved into a database remotely. So it's saved off in some companies' servers, and it's not directly done through the database. Instead, the connection is made from the game to a web service through some web API, and then that's connecting to the database. In general, you don't want to have your database accessible over the network publicly from anything. You don't want games directly connecting to it or anything. You just want your own API that you can then limit, put behind firewalls and all kinds of other security stuff, and have a lot more control over. And then that's reading and writing to your database. And you could use something like a C# web API as a simple layer, or there are a lot of kind of pre-built ones now where you just get the endpoint to find the data and save it off there and then pull it back so that you don't have to build it yourself. If you're at scale, you're going to want to build it yourself probably to save money, but that's when you're in the many hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars and you're actually making money where you need it, or you're working on a project like that. In general, I would just use something that will deal with it on your own. Even though I've built my own plenty of times, I would still go with a pre-built solution, I think, unless
there's always edge cases. Yeah, like it's the same with character controllers. Like there's nothing stopping you making your own, but there's just so many things to consider that you just don't want to do it yourself. So specifically, I would say one thing about that is whenever this question comes up, how do you save as X in Unity? I just want to make it very clear that that question is basically like saying, how do I store a book on a shelf? How do I store a book in a box? How do I store a book, in a container? How do I store a book on a table? Like fundamentally, the question you're saying is databases or data structures of any kind are basically a place that stores data and gives you back data. And yes, there are specific idiosyncrasies depending on web connections and how you do it and whatever else. But fundamentally, your code shouldn't care. So I wouldn't worry about this stuff too much. as long as you have some method called save that takes in a bunch of stuff that needs saving, you can come back to this question later. You can decide to start with saving it on a shelf, and then later on, instead of using a shelf, use a box, right? That stuff there are concerns there, but unless you're talking about super large scale stuff and you're dealing with some really complicated issues, just make your game save to a file or to even something as silly as player prefs, which you shouldn't use for anything too big, but like just start there and it'll work and you can come back to that question later. So don't aim to do a big database just start with something small. And if you design that line where it's like save beyond this point, you should be able to change it up easily enough.
Yeah, that's right. Start with JSON or player prefs or both. Just write it out to a file. And then if you actually need to go to a database, though, like you've got some requirement for work or I don't know, depending on the project, you're definitely going to want to go through either your game server that they're connecting to, writing it to the database, or a web API, depending on how your game. If it's like a multiplayer, like it's an MMO, then the server is connecting to the database, maybe directly, maybe through an API, probably just directly. And that's a relatively easy thing to do in C#. You just make a SQL database connection, or you use one of the ORM wrappers, which is what I would look at. I can't remember the names of them now. There's like 2 or 3 different ones that work in Unity really well. And it's just search for Unity ORM and you'll see, and then start writing that data out. But whatever you do, just don't open up your database publicly to game clients. I've seen that before, and it's a bad idea because then your database is right up there, and all of the people that have bots that go around trying to hack databases are going to be constantly banging the crap out of your database, trying to hack in there and see if there's anything useful that they can steal, take over, or use as a backdoor to get into your other stuff. So it's definitely lock that stuff down. So were you able to find some tips?
I was.
PlayFab. Sorry.
PlayFab's a good one. Yeah.
PlayFab. That is one of the services that I've seen and used before. I would try that one out. And I can't remember the names of the others. I'm sure people in chat know them, though. Feel free to drop them in there. But PlayFab is one of those. All right. I'll shut up and let you go.
So I did get some ready. So let me pull these up here. So the first one's actually a piece of software I recommend more than anything else. And there's a reason why, because I think this is like probably one of the most time-saving bits of software I've ever used in my life. And it's called Everything. Literally, the name of the software is Everything. And it's by a company called Void Tools. And it's effectively a search tool for your computer. And the reason it's so powerful is if you're like me and have multiple copies of Unity installed in your machine and multiple different Unity projects all over the place and multiple folders of different art or different reference material or different PDF documents from clients, sometimes it's very hard to remember exactly where you put one thing in one subfolder in one particular directory. And I think it's bad practice to try to force yourself to remember all of this stuff. So what Void Tools does is it indexes your entire computer. And you can just do a search directly into a text box and it will find everything that matches that search in your entire computer. And it's pretty much instant. So in my case, say, for example, I had a PDF document that had some client requirements on it. I could just write star.pdf space and the first 2 characters of the client name, and it'll find any PDF on my entire system that has those 2 characters in it, and I just find it instantly. Or if there's a script I wrote, which is, I know I did something with input before, I had my own input handler, I could just write input space star.cs, and it'll find me every single C# file on my entire computer with input as part of the name. So as a way of just finding things on your computer, like it drives me insane when I see people who are like struggling going through their hierarchy of stuff on their computer. And it's like, don't waste your time. It's so much easier to just use something like this.
Yep. I've used this too. I think that you recommended this to me a while ago because
I've been using it for years.
A year or so now. Yeah. It's really, really cool. It's really fast too. So anybody who's thinking like, oh, I can just type in Windows search or whatever, find or search, this is so much faster. It's like instant, like autocomplete as you type, you find things. And if I remember right, it also looked inside of the text files too, right?
Yeah, like there's a checkbox you can say search the text files. So it doesn't by default to make it faster, but you can literally ask it to as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and like search the actual text in text files, which was great because it let me search code files. So I do like find stuff that was in there, or find like, say I'm looking for a specific version of a file. Somebody's asking me about it. This happens a lot where people like are looking at a video and they have a question about something. And they're like, I wonder if I still have that. And I can't really find it, but I can like loosely remember the name of the file, or I can see the file name there. I'll search for it, and a lot of times I'll just find it, or a video or other things. It's been super, super handy. So this is a great tool.
You can also do stuff. It also supports regular expressions, which is crazy. Like you can just type any regular expression to find something, and if you type a folder in quotes, it'll go to exactly. It'll only filter through that directory, which makes it quite handy. And you can also index network drives and things. So if you have multiple drives, you can just index the whole lot. So that one I use, and again, as a tie-in to that one, something I've said before is I recommend naming all of your Unity projects with some prefix, because one thing that's really annoying about Unity projects is there's no indication that it's a Unity project. So think about a Visual Studio project. You have an SLN file. You know it's a solution file. If you have various other different kinds of Photoshop files, you know what a PSD is. You've got different systems all have their file extension. Like even Fmod has like the fproj file or whatever. Unity, for some insane reason to me, doesn't have a clickable project file that you can open that will open that project in Unity. Like that seems to me like I still don't understand why they never made that decision. But because of that, it can be very annoying if you've got multiple things related to one project, especially if you're like me and have like a non-Unity version and a Unity part of it, and then a folder full of references for the client, and a folder. They're all named roughly the name of the project, but it's hard to know which bit's the Unity bit. And so every single one of my projects that is actually a runnable, openable in Unity project starts with capital U dot. So U dot project name, U dot other project name, U dot some example, U dot level design example. And every time I see the U dot, I know it is actually a Unity project. And then, let's bring it back to everything tool. I can now write U dot and find every folder that prefixes with U dot, and I know every single Unity project directory on my machine.
That is a cool organization tip. I never thought of that. All my Unity projects are just in a folder, though. So I probably should organize my things better.
Another one. Here's a small one. A lot of people probably know this one already, but it's the plane. I don't know if you can hear that.
I was wondering what that was. It's like
my estate here. There's always some kind of sound. You're blessedly not get to hear most of it because I'm muted. But there's like everything from fire trucks to ice cream vans to planes flying overhead. This place is normally very loud. Anyway, one that I think is very valuable. If you ever find yourself building an object you're putting into an array, so say just like you were saying before about scriptable objects, if you have a bunch of fields on your scriptable object, or you're making a serializable class, and say it has a name, an integer for the ID, and some other values, you'll probably instinctively put the first variable to be the ID, the second one the name, the third one the other properties. If you now display that in an array in Unity, it will use the ID field for the name of the fields. But if you put the name first, it'll actually rename every entry to be the name. So it's a small thing. But basically, if you ever have a collection of some kind of entity that you have made, and that entity is just a collection of fields, whatever one represents the string name, put it at the top, and all of your array listings will read better.
That's a cool trick. I never even realized that. So for anybody who's not done that before, if you have like a serializable attribute on top of a class, and you had a collection of that class, like you've got cars are serializable, and then you've got a collection of cars on there that have the name of the car and maybe the year and the price or whatever the thing is, right? So you're saying then in the inspector you would see the name
instead
of
it
car.
saying instead of saying item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4, item 5, it'll say name of the names on each of the different strings for you. So if you had a bunch of animals, it would actually
it would have been showing like the years of the cars instead, which wouldn't be nearly as useful. I didn't realize that. So it's just kind of like an automatic convention. It just grabs the first serialized.
I think it's only the first string though. I think if it's not a string, it'll just use like an array name or something, like just array 0 index. But if it's a string, it'll replace that with the string value.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
That one's one I use a lot. One that I didn't use before till I saw you do it was Control Alt and left to move the fields in the arguments in a method. That was like I always copied and pasted them, so that one I've added to my list to memorize that one.
I did too. That was a really handy one when I learned it, and I spent like a day just practicing doing it. You just hold down the keys and hit the arrows to move your parameters around left and right and bounce them right. It's especially useful if you want to like rearrange them or you put them in the wrong spot and they're long and you don't want to go in, click, cut, paste, move it over, move the comma. You hit that button and it just like swaps them magically. And you're like, gosh, that was freaking instant. Like, wow.
This is just a general tip that it saved me so much hassle. So frequently I'll write scripts where I will hand the end result to a client. I'll either zip it in a Unity package or something and they'll load it in a project. Now Unity has a really fun habit of ruining those references. So you send someone a script and they open it and it's like remove the field references on the actual thing. And you're like, okay, just drag the thing called this into that and the thing called this into that. And it gets really annoying. And so whenever that happens, anytime I have a script where it's actually its own children. So I do that a lot. I have like a player, which has like player animations, player inventory, and weapons is like underneath it. And I would drag those into the player. And so the player is basically composed of child objects. Whenever I have that scenario, I will make a method on that player or whatever object and call it fix dependencies. And that fix dependencies method is just going to call 3 get components underneath it. It's just going to do it for me. And then it has a little context menu item on it. So now if I ever give someone that script or one of the fields is empty, I can just say to someone, right click the script and click fix. And it will find its own dependencies because it knows where they are relative. That one has saved me so much hassle.
That is handy. That reminds me of one that came up earlier today in the Q&A call. Let me see if I can pull this up. So there was one about context menu and context menu items.
I use those all the time, yeah.
Yeah, if you're not using those, let me see if I can screen share real quick. I'll show what it looks like real quick in here. So go into window. There we go, this one. Okay, so there are 2 different ones. One is the context menu attribute. So you can add this over any method, and then it just makes it appear as a right-click option on the class. So you right-click on the class in the editor and the inspector, like that component. You get the menu says start dialogue, and here is just an example that was calling into a default dialogue, just to show how to do it. Because if you put this over this parameter, here, let's move this down. If you put that over here, it won't work. Because
it won't like that, yeah. It doesn't like the argument, annoyingly.
Yeah.
It really should, though. It should support it, but it doesn't, which really bothers me.
It'd be nice. But the alternative to that, to make that work, is that you could also just have the asset here and you can make a context menu item. A context menu item goes over a field or before a field instead of a method. And then you give it the name of the function that you want to call. And here, I always just use the name of it. Like the examples always do strings and quotes around it, but then if you rename the method, it's going to break. So use name of and the method and then the little dialogue here. And then what this will do is make it so that when I right click on that default dialogue, I can get the context there instead of clicking up at the top of the component. So I thought this was a useful one. Somebody had mentioned maybe we should share it as a tip in the call. So I think it's a good idea. I always forget that people don't know that it exists, and you don't have to go in and create custom stuff or make an update that reads an input or create a custom editor. You can just call stuff with the context menu items right there, those 2 attributes, and it's really easy, super handy, and you can do it at runtime and at edit time. So
and while you're here, because it's one that it's just funny as a side note, again, I've said this before, but you can put, I would actually still do it the way you're doing it here, just because it looks messy, but it's just worth knowing you can put both of those square bracket attributes in the one set of square brackets. That is entirely doable with commas in between. Yeah, that's perfectly fine as well. Just to let people know, you can actually do that if you want to.
Yeah, without a doubt. And a lot of the time, I'll do that. This time, it's just I added in the context.
If it's too long, I won't. Yeah, like I would do it if it's smaller things. I wouldn't do it for larger stuff like that.
Yeah, I usually use it for like text ones and area and range things and stuff where it all kind of makes sense. It comes together good. But yeah, these are super handy context menus. Anyway, I just wanted to share those, and hopefully everybody knows you can use them now. Go try them out, play with them.
So that's it mostly. I do have some other stuff I do want to cover, but they're actually interesting enough. I want to do them as something more kind of substantial. So next time I'm not slightly melting here like the Witch and Wizard of Oz, I will go through I'll actually share my screen and go through some examples. I want to show the validation example one. I think I showed you that, where I have my own custom attribute called validate. And then the other one is I want to cover a bit of project management stuff. I think that would be a good theme for a later series, because I'm currently using a tool called Obsidian, and it's like changing my entire workflow. And so I think it's worth a discussion about that, but it's a whole different conversation.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you more about that too, because I think I wanted to try it out. I came up with scenarios in my head where I was like, that thing that Jason uses would have been cool right now. It's like that tool that Jason uses to like keep track of this would have been neat. Then I would remember who told me that thing that I would just tried out. I was like, who was it that told me this? Because I want to tell them thank you, but I can't remember which of the three people. I still got to figure that out. And now I think I'm gonna try out Obsidian too. And we can try it out and do a whole talk on it. That'd be interesting.
If anyone's looking to get into it, there's a guy called Nick Milo who has a series on getting started with Obsidian that'll teach you all of the basics. I might actually just bring that up so you have a reference here. Let me pull it up now.
I'll definitely have to check that out, because I was convinced after I was thinking, I forget. And the problem is, like, I already forgot what it was that I was all excited to remember who told me about it. I'll figure it out today, though. It'll pop right back into my head, and then I'll go, okay, I need to set up Obsidian. So maybe I'll get it set up after this call and be ready for it when it pops into my head. That'll be the plan going forward. So I've got the video right here. I'm going to save that off. Let's save it for later. And I guess, here, let's hit watch later right there. I guess after that, I should probably tell everybody else to hit the like button and the subscribe button and the save for later, and go add this video to all of their playlists and stuff and drop it on Facebook. I didn't get a chance to really promote it yet, so got to get out there and do that. Also, just thank everybody for coming out. I plan on doing a bunch of videos this week, so my thought was I'm going to see if I can release a video a day for the week, because while I was gone last week, I came up with 1.5 million ideas and got a lot of inspiration of, why don't I make a video about that and that and that and that. So we're going to see how it goes. But if you're interested and want to see lots of stuff on just a bunch of different technical things, and again, I'm going to do a video on mind control game. I think I'll do a live stream building one, like building a Clash Royale style game, because I think I can kind of get that down and have a lot of fun with it. And then maybe do a video on just how to build it, because I think it'd also be fun to build like a Clash Royale style game or something similar. Maybe I'll start with memory and then do Clash Royale after, or I don't know, something fun. I want to do something fun with it, because I was having a blast playing with this thing. And then if anybody's got any other video suggestions or ideas, things that you want to see, drop them in the comments below. I've got like a giant board now full of ideas, so I'm kind of amped up and ready. But make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and go get Jason some coffee. Down. Oh, look at that. Right up on the top there. Just hop right over there. Send over some coffee and stuff, and then I guess
there's also a link, by the way, to anybody who missed the tiny potion example. I put that project linked there, and any other project examples I come up with, I'm going to link there as well. And I actually need to make an article thing about my packages, my Unity packages as well.
That would be a good idea, and then do a full video about them after. Just talk about it, explaining what they are. Because I think that if you had a little video there explaining what that tiny potion one was, people would probably get a lot of value out of it. Or just do a video about the tiny potions and how it works. Or I'm just going to open up your project and do a video about it, Jason. It's definitely cool stuff, so I think people should see it.
Well, like I said, once I show you the other one I'm talking about, the UI one, I think we can strip that to something that's not client facing, just a smaller example that proves the kind of the concept, and that might be another one worth doing a video on how to do UIs in an efficient way that will support changes from a client. But yeah, I'll have to make one that doesn't have client stuff all over it first to show you.
Yeah. That'd be definitely cool. I think UI development is something people always have a difficult time with. It's easy to start, and then it gets very difficult as you add in the second and third and fourth elements, and things get more and more complex. And then the second you want to change, everything falls apart, and you're spending the next 3 days fixing the UI.
Yeah, and again, I actually said this to one of the clients. I said there's a level of confidence that it's very satisfying that I said to them, if you completely want to redesign this UI, it'll take me about an hour. Like it doesn't. I've built it in such a way that the time it'll take me to modify all the visuals without affecting any of the logic is roughly an hour to do that. And I know myself, having been on both sides of that, that's a very powerful thing to have, because most people, if you turn to them and say, "Hey, that UI you've made for us, the settings menu or the inventory or whatever, I want a new one," they're going to have to rebuild the entire thing again, and that's going to take a lot longer than an hour to do that.
Yeah, that's extremely rare. They're gonna have to rebuild it and write new code and a whole bunch of other stuff. So that's cool stuff. All right. Well, anyway, thanks again, everybody, for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, thumbs up, and get Jason some coffee over.
As said, probably iced coffee today, I think, as an example.
Yeah, some extremely high caffeinated stuff. Get him something that's illegal in Ireland. Got so much caffeine. But yeah, I guess we'll see everybody again next week. So thanks again, everybody, for coming out, and thanks, Jason, and
pleasure as always.